This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I recently got hired as a night security guard at the mall. It's a pretty standard gig. Patrol the empty corridors, make sure nothing's out of place, that kind of thing. My first few nights were uneventful, just me and the echoing silence of a massive building after hours. But last Tuesday night, that's when everything changed. I arrived for my shift at 11 p.m. as usual. Mr. Hensley, the head of security, was there to let me in. He seemed on edge, kept glancing around nervously. Before leaving, he pulled me aside and said in a low voice, "Listen, kid, there's something you should know. Things get strange here at night sometimes. Just stick to the rules and you'll be fine." I laughed it off, figuring he was just trying to spook the new guy. But then he handed me a crumpled piece of paper with a list of bizarre rules scrawled on it. 1. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight, 2. If you hear crying, do not investigate. 3. Stay out of the fountain area between 2-4 a.m. 4. Ignore any calls on the mall intercom. 5. Don't enter any stores with their lights on. I started to ask what the hell this was all about, but Mr. Hensley was already hurrying out the door. "Good luck," he called over his shoulder. The heavy metal security gate clanged shut behind him. For the first hour or so, everything seemed normal. I did my usual rounds, checking doors and peering into darkened storefronts. But as midnight approached, a feeling of unease began to creep over me. The massive atrium suddenly felt cavernous and oppressive. Shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edges of my vision. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was just letting my imagination run wild. But then I heard it, the faint sound of sobbing echoing from somewhere in the building. My first instinct was to go investigate, but I remembered rule number 2 and forced myself to ignore it. The crying continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. It was maddening not knowing the source. Around 1 a.m., I was passing by the department store when movement caught my eye. I froze, my heart pounding. One of the mannequins in the window display, a female figure in a red dress, had definitely changed position. Its head was now turned, staring directly at me with blank eyes. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This was impossible, and yet, as I watched in horror, the mannequin's arm began to rise, fingers outstretched towards me. I bolted, sprinting down the corridor as fast as I could. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized I was in the food court. The digital clock on the wall read 1:47 a.m. How was that possible? I'd only been running for a few minutes. That's when I noticed the fountain. It was running, water cascading down its tiers. But instead of the usual clear liquid, a thick red substance flowed from the spouts. It looked disturbingly like blood. I approached cautiously, morbidly transfixed. The metallic smell hit me as I got closer. This couldn't be real. I reached out to touch the liquid. Suddenly, the mall intercom crackled to life. "Security, please report to the main office immediately," a woman's voice announced. It sounded slightly off, distorted somehow. I hesitated, remembering rule number 4. But what if it was Mr. Hensley trying to reach me? What if this was all some elaborate hazing ritual? Before I could decide, the lights in the nearby Victoria's Secret flickered on. I jumped, spinning around. Through the windows, I could see more mannequins slowly turning their heads to stare at me. Panic overwhelmed me. I ran blindly, no destination in mind except away. The mall seemed to stretch endlessly, corridors twisting in ways that defied the layout I knew. Everywhere I turned, there were more mannequins. Some posed normally, others in unnatural contortions, all of them watching me, following me with their eyeless gazes. The intercom kept blaring, that woman's voice growing more insistent, more inhuman. The sound of crying crescendoed, turning into wails of anguish that reverberated through my skull. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. At some point, I found myself huddled in a storage closet, shaking uncontrollably. When I finally worked up the courage to emerge, weak sunlight was filtering through the skylight. It was 6 a.m. My shift was over. I made my way to the security office on trembling legs, desperate for some explanation of what had happened. But when I got there, Mr. Hensley just smiled and asked how my night went, as if nothing unusual had occurred. I tried to tell him about the mannequins, the fountain, the impossible physics of the building. He just looked at me blankly. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "Are you feeling all right?" That's when I noticed the list of rules was gone from my pocket. There was no trace it had ever existed. I quit on the spot. Mr. Hensley didn't seem surprised. As I was leaving, I overheard him on the phone. "Yeah, we're going to need a new night guard. This one didn't work out." I've spent the past week trying to rationalize what happened that night. Was it all a hallucination? Some kind of mental break? Or did I really experience something beyond explanation? All I know is I'm never setting foot in that mall again. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in there is still waiting, watching, ready for the next unsuspecting night guard to walk through those doors. If you've experienced anything like this, please reach out. I need to know I'm not crazy. And if you're considering taking a job as a night security guard, maybe think twice. You never know what's lurking in the shadows after the lights go out. When she arrived that evening, Anne was waiting for me with a stern look on her face. She handed me a worn leather-bound notebook and said, "Alex, read this carefully and follow every instruction to the letter. Your life may depend on it." I laughed nervously, thinking she was just messing with the new guy. But the deadly serious look in her eyes made my smile fade. As Anne showed me around the small convenience store and explained the basic duties, I flipped through the notebook. My eyes widened as I read bizarre instructions like, "Keep exactly half the lights on at all times and clean the northwest corner at 2:17 a.m. sharp." There were cryptic warnings about entities that might appear and how to react to them. One name kept coming up over and over, Fred. Anne?" I asked hesitantly. "What's all this stuff about Fred?" She visibly tensed up. "Just do exactly what the book says if you encounter him. No exceptions." And with that she hurried out the door, leaving me alone as night fell. The first few hours of my shift passed uneventfully. I restocked shelves, rang up the occasional late-night customer, and tried to shake off my growing unease. But as midnight approached, a heavy stillness settled over the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly in the silence. At 12:03 a.m., right on schedule according to the notebook, I heard 3 sharp knocks on the back door. My heart started racing. The instructions said to knock back twice, pause for 4 seconds, then knock 3 more times. With a shaking hand, I approached the door and did as directed. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then I heard shuffling footsteps moving away. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Whatever that was, it seemed satisfied by my response and left. Things escalated quickly after that. At 1:30, all the lights in the store suddenly went out. Panicking, I fumbled for my flashlight and frantically paged through the notebook. It said to immediately light exactly 7 candles and place them in a specific pattern. I found an old box of emergency candles under the register and set them up with trembling hands, praying I was doing it right. As soon as the 7th candle was lit, the power came back on, but now only half the lights were working, creating pools of shadow throughout the store. My skin crawled as I realized this matched the notebook's instructions perfectly. At 2:17 a.m., I grabbed the mop and headed to the northwest corner as directed. As I started cleaning, I noticed strange symbols seeming to appear in the water on the floor, only to vanish when I blinked. I forced myself to keep mopping, refusing to react. The next few hours passed in a blur of increasingly bizarre occurrences. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Whispers echoed from empty aisles. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a dark figure dart past in my peripheral vision, but nothing prepared me for what happened at 4:45 a.m. I was restocking the coolers when I heard the bell over the front door chime. Turning to greet the customer, the words died in my throat. The door was still closed and locked, but standing in front of it was a tall, unnaturally thin figure. It wore a tattered suit and had skin so pale it was almost translucent, but its face, where its face should have been, was just a blank, featureless expanse of flesh. I stood frozen in terror as it slowly turned its head toward me. Though it had no eyes, I could feel it staring into my soul. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move. With shaking hands, I grabbed the notebook and flipped to the section on Fred. "If Fred appears, immediately go to the storage room and close the door," it read. "Do not look directly at him. Recite the words below 3 times, then count to 100. Do not exit until you hear 3 knocks." Heart pounding, I backed slowly toward the storage room, keeping my eyes lowered. The figure, Fred, took a jerky step in my direction. I broke into a run, slamming the storage room door behind me. "Ix nix hocus pocus, Fred be gone, let me be," I chanted 3 times, my voice cracking. Then I started counting, squeezing my eyes shut. As I neared 100, I became aware of a high-pitched whine filling the air. It grew louder and louder until it was a deafening shriek that felt like it was splitting my skull open. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. Just as I thought my head would explode, I heard 3 sharp knocks on the door. Instantly, the shrieking stopped. Shaking violently, I stumbled out of the storage room. The store was empty and still. Fred was gone. But as the adrenaline faded, I realized with horror that I couldn't hear anything out of my left ear. The silence was absolute. I don't know how I made it through the rest of that shift. When Anne arrived in the morning, she took one look at my ashen face and softened. "You encountered Fred, didn't you?" she asked gently. I nodded mutely, still in shock. She sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Alex. I hoped, well, it doesn't matter now. You followed the instructions and survived. That's what's important." What was that thing?" I managed to croak out. Anne shook her head. "I don't know, not really. It's been haunting this place for generations. My family has protected people from it as best we can." She paused. "Will you be back tonight?" I stared at her in disbelief. How could she expect me to come back after what happened? But as the terror of the night faded, I felt an odd sense of pride. I had faced something inexplicable and survived, and strangely, I wanted to understand more. "Yeah," I heard myself say, "I'll be here." Anne smiled sadly. "Get some rest, and Alex, welcome to Star Gasoline." As I drove home in the early morning light, my left ear still ringing with phantom echoes of that unearthly shriek, I knew my life would never be the same. But I also knew I'd be back that night. ready to face whatever horrors awaited me in the shadows of that lonely gas station. It started subtly at first. I'd come home from work and notice things slightly out of place. A chair moved, a cabinet left open. I brushed it off as forgetfulness or stress. But then it escalated. One night, about a week after the gas station incident, I was getting ready for bed around 10 p.m. As I was brushing my teeth, I glanced out the bathroom window and froze. There, in the shadows of my backyard, was a dark figure just standing there, watching. I blinked hard, convinced it was my imagination. But when I looked again, it was still there, motionless, silent. My heart started racing. I quickly turned off the lights and peered out again. The figure was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a neighbor or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next night, same thing. Around 10 p.m., I saw the figure again, this time by my bedroom window. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. It just stood there, staring, for what felt like hours. When I finally worked up the courage to turn on my bedside lamp, it vanished. This continued night after night, always around 10 p.m., always silent and watching. I started dreading nightfall. I'd lay in bed, heart pounding, waiting for it to appear. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Other times I'd hear faint scratching at the windows. I tried everything, new locks, security cameras, even sleeping pills. Nothing helped. The cameras never picked up anything, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence, its eyes on me. I developed a bizarre coping mechanism. If I stayed perfectly still before 10 p.m., it seemed less likely to appear. So I'd lay motionless in bed for hours, barely breathing, praying it would leave me alone. It didn't always work, but it was all I had. Meanwhile, my daily life became a series of frustrating setbacks. My car wouldn't start multiple times, leaving me stranded. I'd misplace my keys constantly, only to find them in places I know I didn't leave them. Once, I came home to find my front door wide open, even though I distinctly remembered locking it. It was like some unseen force was trying to push me back to that gas station, back to where this all started. The familiar surroundings of my hometown now felt alien and threatening. One particularly bad night, I broke down and called my best friend, Jake. I needed someone to talk to, someone to tell me I wasn't going crazy. He came over right away. As I poured out the whole story, Jake listened patiently. I could see the concern in his eyes, but also the skepticism. He suggested maybe I was working too hard, that stress was causing hallucinations. "Look," he said, "why don't I stay over tonight? We'll keep watch together. If there really is something out there, we'll both see it." I agreed, feeling a glimmer of hope. Safety in numbers, right? As night fell, we set up in the living room. Jake took the couch while I sat in my recliner, both of us facing the large bay window. We chatted nervously, trying to keep our spirits up. 9:30 p.m. came and went, then 9:45, 9:55. My palms were sweating, eyes darting to every shadow. Jake kept reassuring me, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. 10 p.m. struck. Nothing happened. We waited in tense silence for what felt like an eternity. Still nothing. Just as Jake opened his mouth to speak, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, I heard Jake gasp. There, pressed against the window, was the figure, its featureless face mere inches from the glass, staring directly at us. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Jake was saying something, shaking me, but his voice sounded far away. The figure raised one long, spindly arm and pressed its hand against the glass. As it did, a deafening crack split the air. The window shattered inward, showering us with glass. I must have blacked out because the next thing I remember is waking up on my living room floor. Sunlight was streaming through the broken window. Jake was gone. Panicked, I called his cell. No answer. I called his house. His mom said he never came home last night. My blood ran cold. I spent the next few days in a daze. Police came and went, asking questions I couldn't answer. How did the window break? Where was Jake? What really happened that night? They found Jake's car still parked outside my house. His wallet and phone were inside. It was like he had simply vanished into thin air. Weeks passed, no sign of Jake. The police investigation stalled. His parents were devastated, and I couldn't shake the guilt. If I hadn't involved him in my nightmare, he'd still be here. The nightly visitations stopped after that. But now I'm plagued by a new fear. What if it took Jake instead of me? What if he's trapped somewhere, suffering because of me? I've thought about going back to that gas station, confronting whatever started this, but I'm terrified of what I might find, or what might find me. So here I am, sharing my story. I don't know if anyone will believe me. I'm not sure I believe it myself sometimes, but I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know Jake is out there somewhere. If you're reading this and you've experienced something similar, please reach out. Maybe together we can make sense of this nightmare. And Jake, if by some miracle you see this, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I won't stop looking for you, I promise. I don't know what's out there, watching from the shadows, but I know it's real, and I know it's not finished with me yet. It all started when Tom's father passed away unexpectedly. Tom was his only child, and suddenly he found himself inheriting the family business, a small gas station on the outskirts of our sleepy little town. At first, we were excited. We thought we'd sell it, use the money to travel the world, maybe start a family. But that's when things started getting weird. The day we put up the for sale sign, Tom had a terrible accident. He was changing a tire for a customer when the jack suddenly gave way, crushing his hand. It was a miracle he didn't lose it entirely. We brushed it off as bad luck, but looking back, that was just the beginning. A week later, as we were packing up some of the old inventory, a shelf collapsed on me. I was buried under boxes of motor oil and windshield wiper fluid. I came out with just a few bruises, but it scared the hell out of us. That's when old man Jenkins, who'd been coming to the station for years, pulled Tom aside. "Boy," he said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking, "you can't sell this place. It's not just a gas station. It's a cornerstone." Tom laughed it off, but I saw the fear in Jenkins' eyes. He wasn't joking. The accidents kept happening. Small things at first. Tools going missing, lights flickering, strange noises in the night. But then, one evening, as Tom was locking up, the gas pump suddenly came to life. Fuel started spraying everywhere, and before we knew it, the whole forecourt was on fire. If it wasn't for the quick thinking of a passing trucker, Tom might not have made it out alive. That night, as we sat in the hospital waiting room, an old woman approached us. She introduced herself as Mabel, a local historian. What she told us chilled me to the bone. "Star Gasoline isn't just a gas station," she explained, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's a gateway, a boundary between our world and something else. It needs to stay open, especially at night. That's when they come through." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss her as a crazy old lady. But after everything we'd been through, I found myself listening. According to Mabel, our town wasn't like others. It had rules, supernatural rules. Certain buildings, certain businesses, they needed to stay open. They needed to maintain their original purpose. And Star Gasoline, it was one of the most important. If you close it, Mabel warned, or try to change its purpose, bad things will happen. Not just to you, but to the whole town. We didn't want to believe her. But as the accidents got worse, as Tom nearly died twice more in the span of a week, we realized we didn't have a choice. So we kept the station open. We worked the night shifts, just like Tom's father had done, just like his grandfather before him. And slowly, the accidents stopped. The strange occurrences faded away. But the damage was done. Tom lost his sight in the last accident. A freak explosion in the garage left him blind. The doctors couldn't explain it. One minute he was fine, the next, darkness. And me? Well, I've aged more in these past 30 years than I care to admit. Every night, from sunset to sunrise, we're here. We pump gas, we sell cigarettes and energy drinks to tired truckers. We pretend everything's normal, but it's not. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see things, shadows that move against the wind, customers whose reflections don't quite match their appearance, cars that pull in for gas, but whose engines make no sound. I've learned not to look too closely, not to question when the credit card machine spits out a receipt covered in strange symbols instead of numbers, not to wonder why some nights the clock on the wall runs backward. But now, I'm tired. Tom's tired. We can't do this forever, but we can't just leave either. We need someone to take over, someone to maintain the boundary. But how do you even begin to explain this to someone? How do you recruit for a job that's more of a life sentence? I've thought about just closing up one night, locking the doors and walking away. But then I remember the fire, the accidents, the look of terror on old man Jenkins' face. And I remember Mabel's warning about what would happen to the town. So here I am, night after night, watching the darkness press against the windows of Star Gasoline, waiting for customers, both normal and not so normal, praying that someday someone will come along who can take this burden from us. Because the truth is, Star Gasoline isn't just a gas station. It's a prison, a duty, a terrible secret. And as much as I want to, I can't just walk away. The consequences are too dire, not just for us, but for everyone in this town. So if you're ever driving through our little town in the dead of night, and you see the flickering neon sign of Star Gasoline, think twice before you pull in. Sure, we'll fill your tank, we'll sell you a candy bar or a pack of smokes. But just know that with every transaction, you're brushing up against something ancient and terrifying. Something that needs to stay hidden, needs to stay contained. And if you see an old woman behind the counter, looking far too tired for her age, that's me. Anne, the reluctant guardian of a gateway I never asked for, but can't escape. And as much as I might smile and make small talk, know that inside, I'm screaming for a way out of this nightmare that I've been living for the past 30 years. But for now, all I can do is ask, fill her up? I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It started out so normal, just another boring Tuesday. I was sitting in my crappy little apartment, strumming my guitar and trying to write a new song. Music was my passion, but lately I'd been in a creative rut. Nothing I wrote felt good enough. I was just about to give up for the day when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something compelled me to pick up. Hello? I said. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a wavering, elderly woman's voice. "Oh, I'm so sorry, dear. I must have dialed the wrong number." "No problem," I replied. "It happens." I was about to hang up when she spoke again. "Wait, would you mind chatting with an old lady for a few minutes? I'm afraid I don't get many calls these days." I hesitated. I didn't really want to, but she sounded so lonely. Sure," I said. "I guess I can talk for a bit." "Oh, thank you, dear. My name is Diane. What's yours?" I told her my name and we made some small talk. She asked about my job, my hobbies. I mentioned I was a musician and she perked up, asking what instruments I played. It was a pleasant enough conversation, if a bit awkward. After about 10 minutes, I made an excuse about needing to go. "It was nice talking to you, Diane," I said. "You as well, dear," she replied. "Perhaps we'll speak again sometime." I hung up, not thinking much of it. Just a lonely old woman looking for some connection. I felt a twinge of sadness for her, but soon forgot about it as I went back to working on my music. The next day, my phone rang again. I answered without checking the number. "Hello, dear. It's Diane," came the familiar wavering voice. "I hope you don't mind me calling again. I so enjoyed our chat yesterday." I was a bit taken aback. How did she have my number? I was sure I hadn't given it to her. "Oh, hi, Diane," I said. How did you get this number?" There was a pause. "Oh, silly me. I must have written it down wrong yesterday and accidentally dialed you again. What a happy accident." Something felt off, but I brushed it aside. We talked for a few more minutes before I made another excuse to go. The calls continued over the next few days, always around the same time, always Diane. At first I tried to be polite, but it was starting to get annoying. I asked her repeatedly not to call anymore, but she always had some excuse for why she accidentally dialed me again. After about a week, I was at my wit's end. I decided to be more forceful. "Diane, please stop calling me," I said firmly when she rang again. "I don't want to be rude, but this needs to stop. I'm going to block your number." Her voice turned cold. "You ungrateful boy. After all the time I've given you, this is how you repay me? You'll regret this." The line went dead. I breathed a sigh of relief and blocked her number, hoping that would be the end of it. For a few days, everything was quiet. No more calls from Diane. I started to relax, thinking the whole weird episode was over. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. The caller ID showed it was blocked. With a sense of dread, I answered. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Did you really think you could get rid of me that easily?" Diane's voice hissed, but it sounded wrong, distorted, and unnatural. How are you calling me?" I stammered. "I blocked your number." She laughed, a horrible screeching sound. "Oh, you foolish boy. Did you think a mere phone could keep me away? I exist beyond your petty technology." A chill ran down my spine. What are you?" "I am loneliness. I am despair. I am the void that comes for us all in the end," she intoned. "And now I'm coming for you." The lights in my apartment began to flicker. The mirror on my bathroom wall cracked. I could hear a low, rumbling sound coming from somewhere. "Stop it!" I yelled. "Leave me alone!" "I can't do that, dear," Diane said, her voice dripping with malice. "You see, I need you. I've been alone for so long. My family, they're all gone, taken from me in an instant." Her tone softened, becoming wistful. "It was supposed to be a happy day, a family picnic by the lake. My brother was driving. He only looked away for a moment, just a moment, but it was enough." I found myself transfixed by her words, unable to move or speak. "The crash happened so fast," she continued. I was the only one who survived, if you can call it that, trapped in a broken body, watching as my family slipped away one by one. And then, nothing. An endless void of loneliness. I'm sorry, I managed to say. That's terrible. But why me? Why are you doing this? Because I'm tired of being alone, she shrieked. I want to live again, and you, my dear boy, are going to help me do that. Suddenly, I felt a presence in the room with me, an oppressive weight pressing down on me from all sides. I stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the sink for support. In the cracked mirror, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. An old woman's face stared back at me, her eyes sunken and full of hunger. "No!" I screamed. "Get out of my head!" I could feel her trying to take control, pushing at the edges of my consciousness. My body began to move of its own accord, my hands reaching for my throat. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and smashed it against the mirror, shattering both. The pressure in my head lessened slightly, but I could still feel Diane's presence. "You can't escape me," her voice echoed in my mind. "I'll always be here, waiting. And one day, when you least expect it, I'll take what's mine." I collapsed to the floor, surrounded by broken glass and plastic. I don't know how long I lay there, shaking and crying. When I finally pulled myself together, the oppressive presence was gone. But I could still feel a lingering chill in the air. In the days that followed, I changed my phone number. I moved to a new apartment. I even saw a therapist, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of mental break. But deep down, I know the truth. Diane is still out there, waiting. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I can still hear her voice whispering to me. And in my nightmares, I see her standing at the edge of a dark void, beckoning me to join her. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of her. All I can do is keep moving forward, hoping that someday, somehow, I'll find a way to banish her for good. But until then, I live in fear, always looking over my shoulder, wondering when Diane will strike again. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was the middle of summer in Carson City, Nevada, and I was desperate for a job. I'd been bouncing between minimum wage gigs for months, barely scraping by. So when I saw the "Help Wanted" sign in the window of the Lone Star Diner, I figured I'd give it a shot. Little did I know what I was getting myself into. The moment I walked in, something felt off. The place was almost empty except for a few truckers hunched over coffee mugs at the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the worn vinyl booths. But beggars can't be choosers, right? I approached the counter and asked about the job opening. That's when I met Melanie, the manager. She was a short, stocky woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was stern, all business. She looked me up and down with narrowed eyes before nodding curtly. "You'll do," she said. "Come to the back office." I followed her through the kitchen, past a sullen-looking cook flipping burgers. In the tiny office, Melanie got right down to business. "The job pays $50 an hour," she said. I nearly choked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. $50 an hour, cash. But there are rules. Strict rules. Break them, and you're out. No second chances. Got it?" I nodded dumbly, still reeling from the salary. This had to be too good to be true. Melanie ran through the basics. Uniform requirements, shift schedules, etc. But then her tone got even more serious. "Now listen carefully," she said, leaning in. "Once a month we get a special customer, a man. You'll know him when you see him. Tall, thin, always wearing a black coat. Do not approach him. Do not speak to him. Do not look directly at him. Serve him like any other customer, but keep your distance. Understood? Sure, I said hesitantly. But why? No questions, Melanie snapped. Just do as you're told. Break this rule, and there will be consequences. Severe consequences. I swallowed hard and nodded. The whole thing was bizarre, but for $50 an hour, I'd have agreed to just about anything. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I got used to the rhythm of the diner, the early morning truckers, the lunchtime rush, the late-night stragglers. My co-workers were a quiet bunch, keeping to themselves mostly. I tried making small talk a few times, but they always seemed on edge, watching the door nervously. Then came that night. It was about a month into the job, just past midnight. The diner was empty except for me, the cook, and Melanie. I was wiping down tables when the bell above the door chimed. I turned and felt my blood run cold. There he was, the man Melanie had warned me about, tall and impossibly thin, wearing a long black coat despite the summer heat. His face was hidden in shadow under a wide-brimmed hat. The cook ducked into the kitchen. Melanie's eyes went wide, and she gestured frantically for me to get behind the counter. I complied, my heart pounding. The man glided, there's no other word for it, to a booth in the corner. He didn't make a sound, didn't even seem to breathe. Melanie nudged me. "Take his order," she hissed. "Remember the rules." On shaking legs, I approached the booth, keeping my eyes down. Can I take your order, sir?" I stammered. A long pause, then a voice that made my skin crawl. It was wrong somehow, like multiple voices layered on top of each other, some too high, some too low. "Coffee, black." I scribbled it down and practically ran back to the counter. As I poured the coffee with trembling hands, I snuck glances at the man. He just sat there, perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I brought him the coffee, setting it down without a word. He didn't touch it, just kept staring. For the next hour, that's all he did. Sat motionless, coffee untouched, staring at nothing. The atmosphere in the diner was suffocating. I could barely breathe. Then, as suddenly as he'd arrived, he stood up. In one fluid motion, he glided to the door and was gone. The moment the door closed behind him, Melanie and the cook sagged with relief. I realized I'd been holding my breath. What was that?" I asked shakily. Melanie shot me a warning look. "Don't ask questions. Just be glad it's over for another month." But I couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, I kept replaying that night in my mind. The man's impossible stillness, that unsettling voice, the palpable fear from my co-workers. Something was very, very wrong here. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. I noticed things I'd overlooked before, like how the diner seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest building, or the unmarked black vans that sometimes parked across the street, men in suits watching the diner through binoculars. One night, I overheard Melanie on the phone in her office. The door was cracked open, and I couldn't help but listen in. "Yes, sir. No changes in its behavior. No, the staff have been compliant. I understand the importance. Yes, we'll be ready for next month's observation." Observation? What the hell was going on here? I knew I was playing with fire, but I had to know more. So I started snooping. I picked the lock on Melanie's office one night after closing and rifled through her files. Most of it was mundane paperwork, but then I found a folder labeled Project Lone Star. Inside were pages of dense scientific jargon I couldn't make sense of. Terms like extra-dimensional entity and temporal displacement. But one phrase jumped out at me. Missing persons correlated with Entity R sightings. My blood ran cold. Were people disappearing because of that thing that came to the diner? I dug deeper and found a list of names. Dozens of them, all labeled vanished. With growing horror, I realized I recognized some of them. They were former employees of the diner. Just then, I heard a noise outside the office. Footsteps approaching. I shoved everything back in place and slipped out, heart pounding. The next day, I couldn't concentrate. My mind was racing. This wasn't just some weird diner. It was part of something much bigger and much more sinister. I decided to confront Melanie. I cornered her in the kitchen during a lull. "I know what's really going on here," I said in a low voice. "The man, the disappearances, all of it. What is this place?" Melanie's face went white. "You fool!" she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered. A chill swept through the diner, and there, standing in the doorway, was the man in black. But it wasn't his usual day. He was early. Everything happened so fast after that. Melanie shoved me towards the back door, screaming at me to run. I heard inhuman shrieks behind me as I fled into the night. I ran until my lungs burned, not daring to look back. When I finally stopped, the diner was nowhere in sight, just empty desert all around. I made my way back to town and went straight to the police. But when I tried to tell them what happened, they just stared at me blankly. They had no record of any Lone Star diner, said there had never been a diner at that location. I've spent the years since then trying to make sense of it all, trying to find answers, but every lead I follow turns to nothing. It's like the diner never existed. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember that voice, that impossible stillness, the look of terror on Melanie's face at the end, and I know it was real. I don't know what that thing was or why it came to the diner. I don't know what happened to Melanie or the others, but I know I was lucky to escape, and I live every day wondering when it might come for me next. The allotment was about a 10-minute drive from our house, down some winding country lanes. As we pulled up in Dad's old pickup truck, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires as we parked. "Grab that bag of feed, will you?" Dad said, gesturing to the back of the truck. I hopped out and hefted the heavy sack onto my shoulder. The beam from Dad's flashlight swept across the overgrown path leading to our plot. As we walked, I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard a twig snap somewhere in the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Dad. He paused, listening. "Probably just a fox or something," he said after a moment. But I noticed he picked up the pace a bit after that. When we reached our chicken coop, I breathed a sigh of relief. The familiar clucking of the hens was oddly comforting. Dad unlatched the door and I poured the feed into their trough while he checked their water. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the bushes about 20 feet away. I squinted, trying to make out what it was in the dim light. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a person. "Dad," I hissed urgently, "I think there's someone over there." He straightened up, shining the flashlight in the direction I was pointing. The beam illuminated nothing but leaves and branches. "I don't see anything, son," he said, but his voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. As we locked up the coop, I kept glancing nervously over my shoulder. The walk back to the truck seemed to take an eternity. Just as we reached it, Dad suddenly grabbed my arm, pulling me to a stop. "Wait," he whispered. In the silence I heard it too, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from us through the underbrush. Dad quickly ushered me into the truck, and we drove home in tense silence. It wasn't until we were safely inside that he finally spoke. "I think that might have been John," he said quietly. "Your old friend John?" I asked, confused. "I thought he moved away after his divorce." Dad sighed heavily. He did for a while, but I heard he's been staying at his old allotment plot lately. He's not been doing so well. I remembered John from when I was younger. He used to come over for barbecues, always laughing and joking with Dad. But the last time I'd seen him, shortly before he left town, he'd looked haggard and wild-eyed. His wife had left him for another man, and the gossip was that he'd had some kind of breakdown. Why would he be skulking around our plot? I asked, a chill running down my spine. I'm not sure, Dad said, his brow furrowed with worry. But I think we should be careful for a while. Maybe I'll go feed the chickens on my own for a bit. But of course I insisted on going with him. I couldn't let my dad face potential danger alone. So 2 nights later, we found ourselves back at the allotment. This time, we brought a more powerful flashlight, and Dad had a heavy wrench in his hand, just in case. The moment we stepped out of the truck, I felt that same prickling sensation of being watched. We moved quickly down the path, the beam of the flashlight sweeping back and forth. As we neared the chicken coop, I saw a dark figure dart between 2 sheds about 50 feet away. "There!" I gasped, pointing. Dad swung the light around, but the figure had vanished. We stood stock still, listening intently. Then we heard it, a low, raspy chuckle coming from the darkness. "John?" Dad called out, his voice steady despite the tension I could see in his shoulders. "Is that you, mate? Come on out, let's talk." There was no response, just the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. We hurried to feed the chickens, neither of us taking our eyes off the surrounding shadows for more than a second. As we were locking up the coop, I glimpsed movement again. This time, I clearly saw a man's figure, hunched and menacing, standing at the edge of our plot, and in his hand, glinting in the moonlight, was what looked like the blade of an axe. "Dad!" I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. He saw it too. Without a word, he grabbed my arm and we ran for the truck. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after us, getting closer and closer. We threw ourselves into the cab and Dad gunned the engine, peeling out of the lot in a spray of gravel. In the rearview mirror, illuminated by our tail lights, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. Even from a distance I could make out the wild, tangled beard and the glint of the axe blade. We drove straight to the police station and reported what had happened. They sent officers out to the allotment, but found no sign of John or anyone else. They did, however, find fresh footprints around our plot and, most chillingly, deep gouges in the door of our chicken coop that looked like they'd been made by an axe. For weeks after that, we didn't go back to the allotment. The police increased patrols in the area, but John seemed to have vanished into thin air. Slowly, life started to return to normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of that figure in the darkness or the sound of that chilling laugh. About a month later, Dad decided it was time to check on the chickens again. I insisted on going with him, despite the knot of fear in my stomach. We arrived just before dusk, hoping the fading light would make us feel safer. As we approached the coop, everything seemed quiet and normal. But then I noticed something odd. The latch on the coop door was undone. Dad and I exchanged a worried glance before he slowly pushed the door open. The coop was empty. Not a single chicken remained. And there, scratched crudely into the wooden wall, was a message that made my blood run cold. "Next time it won't be the chickens." We called the police again, but they found no leads. John was never seen in the area again. To this day, I don't know what happened to him or why he targeted us. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that raspy chuckle in the darkness, and I wonder if he's out there, waiting. We sold the allotment soon after that. Dad said it was because we were too busy to maintain it. But I knew the real reason. Neither of us could stand the thought of going back there, of facing those shadows and the memories of the man who lurked within them. Years have passed, but I've never forgotten those terrifying nights at the allotment. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a series of coincidences, that we let our imaginations run wild. But then I remember the look in Dad's eyes when he saw that message scratched into the coop, and I know it was all too real. I don't know what became of John, or if he ever got the help he so clearly needed. Part of me hopes he found peace somehow, but another part of me still looks over my shoulder on dark nights, half expecting to see a shadowy figure with an axe, ready to finish what he started all those years ago. We got the tent up and started a small fire to cook dinner on. The temperature was dropping fast as night fell, but we were cozy by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and chatting about our day on the trail. It was so peaceful out there in the wilderness, nothing but the crackling fire and chirping crickets. That tranquility was shattered when we heard the snap of a branch behind us. We both whipped around, startled. A man stepped out of the shadows into the firelight. My heart started racing immediately. Something felt very, very wrong. He was tall and thin, with wild, unkempt hair and beard, but it was his eyes that really unnerved me. They had this vacant, far-away look. He was dressed in regular clothes, jeans and a hoodie, but they were filthy and torn. No backpack, no camping gear at all. Who wanders around the Appalachian Trail at night with no supplies? "Hello there," he said in an oddly cheerful tone that didn't match his appearance at all. "Mind if I warm myself by your fire for a bit?" Tom and I exchanged a worried glance. We didn't want to seem rude or unwelcoming to a fellow hiker, but every instinct was screaming that this guy was bad news. Sure," Tom said hesitantly. "Feel free." The stranger sat down across the fire from us. Up close, I could see how gaunt his face was, cheeks hollow and eyes sunken. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes and lit one, taking a long drag. "The name's James," he said. "James Sovereign Jordana. You folks out here hiking the AT?" We nodded, introducing ourselves. I was trying to keep my voice steady, but inside I was trembling. "How many of you are camping here tonight?" James asked, his eyes darting around our site. "Just us two," Tom replied. I wished he hadn't answered. "Ah, I see," James said, nodding to himself. "And how far to the next campsite, you reckon?" Tom shrugged. "Not sure exactly. A few miles, maybe?" James kept peppering us with questions, how long we'd been on the trail, where we were headed next, if we'd seen any other hikers that day. With each question, my anxiety ratcheted up another notch. Why was he so interested in our plans, and if we were alone? I noticed James was fidgeting with something in his pocket. My imagination went into overdrive. Was it a knife? A gun? I squeezed Tom's hand, trying to silently communicate my fear. "Well, it's getting late," Tom said, faking a yawn. "We should probably turn in soon." But James made no move to leave. He just kept sitting there, chain-smoking and staring at us with those unblinking eyes. The silence stretched on, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly. "I need to use the bathroom," I blurted out. "Tom, will you come with me?" Tom looked confused for a second, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Oh, sure, honey." We walked a short distance into the woods, just far enough to be out of earshot. "We need to get out of here," I whispered urgently. "That guy is seriously creeping me out. I think he might be dangerous." Tom nodded grimly. "I know. I'm getting bad vibes too. But what can we do? It's pitch black out here. We can't hike in the dark." I was on the verge of panic. "We have to try. I'd rather take my chances in the woods than stay here with him. Please, Tom, I'm really scared." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's grab our stuff and go. But we need to be smart about this." We crept back to the campsite, trying to act normal. James was still sitting there, staring into the fire. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes boring into me. "Fine, thanks," I said, forcing a smile. "We're pretty beat, though. Gonna hit the sack." We started gathering up our things, shoving everything haphazardly into our packs. I was hyper-aware of James watching our every move. "Sure you don't want to stay up and chat a while longer?" he asked. There was an edge to his voice now that sent chills down my spine. "Thanks, but we've got an early start tomorrow," Tom said. We'd barely gotten the tent down when James suddenly stood up. "You folks heading out?" he asked, taking a step towards us. Adrenaline surged through me. This was it. He wasn't going to let us leave. "Change of plans," Tom said, slinging his pack on. "Gonna night hike for a bit. Enjoy the stars." James took another step closer. I could see something glinting in his hand. A knife. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said softly. "Why don't you stay here with me?" Tom grabbed my hand. "Run!" he yelled. We took off sprinting into the darkness. I could hear James crashing through the underbrush behind us, shouting for us to come back. Branches whipped at my face as we ran blindly through the forest. My lungs were burning, but terror kept me going. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes, we finally slowed down. I couldn't hear James anymore. We crouched behind a fallen tree, struggling to catch our breath. "Do you think we lost him?" I whispered. Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but we can't stop. We have to keep moving." We hiked through the night, using the dim light of our phones to try to follow the trail. Every snapping twig made me jump. I kept imagining James lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. Finally, blessedly, the sky began to lighten. As the sun rose, we stumbled into a campground where a group of other hikers were having breakfast. We collapsed, exhausted and shaking. The other hikers were alarmed by our appearance and story. They offered us food and water, and one of them had a satellite phone to call for help. The park rangers came and took our statement, but said there wasn't much they could do without more to go on. Tom and I cut our trip short and went home that day. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about James's dead eyes and that glinting knife. I kept obsessively checking the news, terrified I'd see a story about murders on the Appalachian Trail. And then, in May 2019, it happened. A man attacked several hikers on the AT, killing one and severely injuring another. When I saw his mugshot, my blood ran cold. It was him, James Jordan, the man from our campsite. I was overwhelmed with conflicting emotions, horror at what he'd done, grief for his victims, but also relief and gratitude that we'd escaped. If we hadn't run that night, it could have been us. To this day, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around how close we came to being murdered that night. It's surreal to think we had a conversation with a killer, that we were probably only minutes away from being his victims. I've never felt as viscerally afraid as I did in those moments, and I hope I never do again. I still love hiking and being in nature, but I'm much more cautious now. I'm hyper-vigilant about my surroundings, and we always carry protection. That night changed me forever. I know now that evil is real, and sometimes it finds you in the most beautiful places. That's when Tyler mentioned the old abandoned sanitarium up in the hills. There had always been rumors about it being haunted, with people claiming to hear screams and see shadowy figures in the windows. Most of us brushed it off as small-town gossip, but Tyler swore his older brother had gone up there once and experienced some seriously creepy stuff. I was skeptical, but also intrigued. The idea of a real paranormal encounter was thrilling. After some debate, we decided to drive up there and check it out for ourselves. What's the worst that could happen, right? We piled into Jake's beat-up Corolla around 11 p.m. The drive up into the mountains was about 45 minutes on winding back roads. We were all in high spirits at first, joking around and blasting music. But as we got further away from town, a weird tension started to build. The dense forest pressing in on both sides of the narrow road felt oppressive somehow. About 20 minutes in, the radio started acting up. At first, it was just occasional bursts of static interrupting the music. We didn't think much of it. Reception was always spotty in the mountains. But then things got stranger. The radio would suddenly change stations on its own, or the volume would crank up to max without anyone touching it. Jake tried turning it off, but it would come back on by itself a few minutes later. We started to get a little freaked out, exchanging nervous glances. I tried to rationalize it as some kind of electrical problem with the old car, but deep down, I had a growing sense of dread. Things escalated quickly after that. The static became constant, punctuated by snippets of distorted voices and what sounded like bits of old-timey music. It was deeply unsettling. The voices didn't sound like any radio DJ or song I'd ever heard. They had an otherworldly quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At one point, we clearly heard what sounded like a woman's voice singing a lullaby, but it was warped and distorted in a way that was just wrong. It made my skin crawl. Mia started crying, begging Jake to turn around and go home. But something compelled us to keep going. We were all on edge, jumping at every shadow. The forests seemed to press in closer. The darkness beyond our headlights felt alive somehow. I kept thinking I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. About 5 minutes from the sanitarium, Jake got fed up and yanked the fuse for the radio, killing it completely. We drove in tense silence for a while, everyone lost in their own anxious thoughts. Then we heard it. A soft, staticky hum coming from the dead radio. It slowly increased in volume until we could make out words. It sounded like someone chanting in a language I didn't recognize. How was this possible with the fuse removed? We were all freaking out at this point. Jake was white-knuckling the steering wheel, cursing under his breath. Tyler kept repeating, "This isn't real, this can't be happening," over and over. I was in the passenger seat, and I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly. My breath was coming out in visible puffs, even though it was the middle of summer. The windows started to fog up, and frost formed in the corners. That's when I saw it. As I was using my sleeve to clear the fog from the windshield, I caught a glimpse of something. It looked like long, spindly fingers pushing through the glass from the outside. But that was impossible. We were going 50 mph down a mountain road. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. But when I looked again, they were still there. Pale, almost translucent fingers reaching towards us. I could see every knuckle, every wrinkle in the skin. They moved in a jerky, unnatural way that made my stomach turn. I screamed, causing Jake to swerve wildly. The others saw it too and started panicking. The fingers were slowly pushing further in, like the windshield was made of jello. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to look away. Just as the fingertips were about to breach the inside of the car, Jake slammed on the brakes and cranked the wheel. We spun out, tires screeching. I was certain we were going to crash and die right there on that lonely mountain road. Somehow, Jake managed to regain control. He flipped a U-turn and floored it back towards town. We were all hysterical, screaming, crying, praying. I kept looking back, terrified we were being pursued by whatever otherworldly thing had reached for us. The drive back was a blur. The radio remained mercifully silent, and we saw no more ghostly apparitions. But the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't lift until we were back in the light and noise of town. We pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and just sat there for a while, trying to process what had happened. None of us could explain it. We swore we'd never speak of it to anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? I didn't sleep for days afterwards. I kept reliving those moments in my mind, questioning my sanity. Even now, years later, I get chills thinking about it. I've never experienced anything like it since, thank God. Part of me still tries to rationalize it. Maybe we were all caught up in some kind of shared hallucination or mass hysteria. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Whatever reached for us that night wasn't of this world. I avoid driving in the mountains at night now, and I never listen to the radio after dark, just in case. Some things are better left unexplained, I guess. But I'll never forget that terrifying night, or the lingering feeling that something out there was calling to us, trying to pull us into a darkness we weren't meant to understand. It was late summer, and my childhood friend Joe was back in town for a visit. We hadn't seen each other in years, but it felt like no time had passed as we fell back into our old routines. We spent the first few days catching up, reminiscing about all the trouble we used to get into as kids. On his last night in town, we decided to go for a hike along the old railroad tracks that run through the forest outside of town. It was something we used to do all the time growing up. Sneak out after dark and walk the tracks, telling ghost stories and daring each other to venture deeper into the woods. We set out around sunset, packs loaded with snacks and flashlights. The nostalgia hit hard as we made our way down the overgrown path to the tracks. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but that familiar sense of adventure came rushing back. As darkness fell, we clicked on our flashlights and continued deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. An owl hooted in the distance, making us both jump. We laughed it off, but I could feel a growing uneasiness in the pit of my stomach. We must have walked for a couple of hours when Joe suddenly stopped short. "Hey, do you see that?" he whispered, pointing off to our left. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what he was looking at. And then I saw it, a faint glow through the trees, maybe a quarter mile off the tracks. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Joe shrugged. "Let's check it out." Part of me wanted to keep walking, to stick to our original plan, but curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself following Joe as we veered off the tracks and into the dense underbrush. As we got closer, the glow resolved itself into the vague outline of a building. My heart started racing as I realized what we were looking at. An old church, right in the middle of nowhere. Its weathered wooden walls loomed before us, the steeple stretching up into the night sky. "Holy shit," Joe breathed. "How long do you think this has been here?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. The church looked ancient, like something out of a horror movie. Paint peeled from the walls, and vines snaked up the sides. Most of the windows were boarded up, but a faint light leaked out from a few cracks. We crept closer, leaves crunching under our feet. As we neared the front steps, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wood, not crosses or any religious iconography I recognized. They looked almost occult. A chill ran down my spine. "Joe, maybe we should go," I whispered. But he was already reaching for the door handle. To our surprise, it opened with a low creak. Joe flashed me a grin and stepped inside. Against my better judgment, I followed. The interior was musty and thick with cobwebs. Rows of rotting pews faced a crumbling altar. Tattered hymn books lay scattered on the floor. But strangest of all were the candles, dozens of them, flickering in every corner of the church. Who lit all these? I wondered aloud. Joe didn't answer. He was staring transfixed at something on the altar. I moved closer to see what had caught his attention. There, arranged in a neat semicircle, were 7 old-fashioned oil lamps. They weren't lit, but the glass was clean and polished, like they'd been placed there recently. A board creaked somewhere behind us. We both whirled around, hearts pounding. But the church was empty save for us and the dancing shadows cast by candlelight. "We need to get out of here," I hissed, tugging on Joe's sleeve. This time he nodded in agreement. We hurried back to the entrance, only to find the door had swung shut behind us. Joe yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rising in my throat, I threw my weight against it. Nothing. And then we heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from somewhere outside. It started soft, barely audible, but grew steadily louder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I recognized words in a language I didn't understand. We pressed our faces to a gap in the boarded-up windows, trying to see what was happening. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. A procession of robed figures was emerging from the trees, moving slowly towards the church. There must have been at least 24 of them, each carrying one of those old oil lamps. The flames cast an eerie glow on their faces, or where their faces should have been, because each figure wore a blank wooden mask, featureless save for 2 eye holes. Joe and I exchanged terrified glances. We had to get out of there now. We redoubled our efforts on the door, throwing our full weight against it again and again. Just as I thought my shoulder would give out, it finally burst open with a splintering crack. We tumbled out onto the front steps, coming face to face with the lead figures of the procession. For a moment, everything froze. I stared into the empty eye holes of the nearest mask, paralyzed with fear. Then Joe grabbed my arm and we ran. We plunged into the woods, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. I could hear shouts behind us, the chanting replaced by angry cries. My lungs were on fire, legs pumping furiously as we sprinted through the darkness. I had no idea where we were going. All I knew was that we had to get away from that church and whatever hellish ritual we'd interrupted. We ran for what felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit fading and then disappearing altogether. Finally, gasping for breath, we collapsed against a fallen tree. "What the fuck was that?" Joe panted. I shook my head, still too winded to speak. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. None of it seemed real. We sat there for a long time, listening to the normal sounds of the forest return around us. No more chanting, no footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, just crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. When we'd caught our breath, we started trying to figure out where we were. It took some time, but we eventually found our way back to the railroad tracks and followed them out of the forest. The sky was starting to lighten by the time we made it back to town. We went straight to my place and collapsed, physically and emotionally drained. We tried to talk about what happened, to make sense of it, but the more we discussed it, the less real it seemed. If we hadn't both been there, I might have thought it was just a vivid nightmare. Joe left for home later that day. We promised to keep in touch, to try and figure out what we'd witnessed. But as the weeks passed, our conversations became less frequent. It was like we both wanted to forget it had ever happened. I've gone back to those woods a few times since then, in the daylight. I've never been able to find that church again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. but then I'll catch a whiff of musty air or hear a snatch of chanting on the wind, and it all comes rushing back. I don't know what we stumbled upon that night. Some kind of cult, an ancient ritual, or something even stranger. All I know is that it changed me. I can't look at the world the same way anymore, knowing what might be hiding in the shadows of the forest. So that's my story. I'm not sure why I'm sharing it now, after all this time. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has seen something similar, that I'm not going crazy. Or maybe I just needed to get it off my chest. Either way, I don't think I'll ever forget that night in the abandoned church. And I'll never stop wondering about those masked figures and what would have happened if we hadn't gotten away. It was supposed to be a fun father-son outing. My dad had been taking me hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle, and I always looked forward to our trips together. This time, we invited my dad's friend Frank to join us. Frank was an experienced hunter, and I was excited to learn from him. We headed out to our usual spot in the woods early that crisp October morning. The leaves were starting to change color, and there was a chill in the air that made me glad I'd layered up. As we hiked to our favorite clearing, I felt that familiar mix of anticipation and nerves. Even after years of hunting trips, I still got a little jittery at the start. We set up in our usual spots. My dad and Frank spread out to cover more ground, while I took position near a cluster of trees with good sight lines. For the first couple hours, everything was calm and quiet. I scanned the tree line, looking for any movement, my finger resting lightly on the trigger guard of my rifle. That's when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a branch swaying in the breeze, but when I turned to look directly, my blood ran cold. There was a man standing about 50 yards away, partially obscured by foliage, and he was pointing a rifle directly at me. I froze, not daring to move a muscle. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it my dad or Frank? No, this guy was a stranger. I could see enough to tell it wasn't anyone I knew. Plus, they would never point a gun at me like that. For several agonizing seconds, I stayed perfectly still, barely even breathing. The barrel of his rifle didn't waver. It was aimed straight at my chest. I wanted to call out, to ask who he was or what he was doing, but some instinct told me to stay silent. Suddenly, the man took a step to the side, moving behind a tree. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe he was just passing through and hadn't actually seen me. But when he emerged on the other side of the trunk, his rifle was still trained directly on me. How was that possible? He should have lost his aim when he moved. A cold sweat broke out all over my body. This wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong here. I tried to control my panicked breathing as I racked my brain for what to do. Should I run? Try to get to my dad? But the rational part of my mind knew any sudden movement could be disastrous if this guy had his finger on the trigger. So I stayed rooted to the spot, my legs trembling. The strange hunter continued his unnerving behavior. He would duck behind trees or move to new positions, sometimes even disappearing from view entirely for heart-stopping moments. But every single time he reappeared, that rifle barrel was pointed straight at me with unwavering precision. It was as if he had some kind of supernatural awareness of exactly where I was at all times. I lost all sense of time as this nightmarish game of cat and mouse played out. It could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was that paralyzing fear had taken hold of me completely. I was certain that at any moment I would hear the crack of a gunshot and feel the impact of a bullet. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, I heard my dad's voice calling out from somewhere to my right. "Tommy, you see anything yet?" I opened my mouth to respond, to cry out for help, but no sound came out. My throat had closed up from fear. I managed to tear my eyes away from the menacing hunter for a split second, looking in the direction of my dad's voice. When I snapped my gaze back, the man was gone. I blinked hard, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But he had vanished completely. The woods were silent and still once more. On shaky legs, I stumbled in the direction I'd heard my dad. I practically fell into his arms when I reached him, babbling incoherently about the man with the rifle. My dad looked bewildered and concerned. He radioed Frank to come meet us. As I struggled to explain what had happened, Frank joined us with a confused look on his face. That's when things took an even stranger turn. "Wait a second," Frank said, holding up his hand. "Tommy, where exactly were you standing?" I pointed back towards the cluster of trees. Frank's eyes widened. "Oh shit," he muttered. "Kid, I am so sorry. I think that was me you saw." I stared at him in disbelief as he explained. Apparently, he had spotted a huge buck in that area earlier. He'd been stalking it carefully, trying to get a clear shot. In the process, he'd inadvertently been lining up his shot in my direction multiple times as the deer moved around. "I had no idea you were over there," Frank said, looking genuinely upset. "I was so focused on tracking that deer, I guess I didn't realize. God, I feel awful. I must have scared you half to death." I nodded mutely, still trying to process this new information. On one hand, I felt immense relief, knowing there hadn't actually been some crazed hunter out to get me. But on the other hand, the realization of how close I'd come to potentially being shot by accident was almost as terrifying. My dad put his arm around my shoulders. "It's okay, son. These things can happen out here if we're not careful. But you did the right thing staying still. Why don't we call it a day and head home?" I nodded gratefully. As we hiked back to the truck, my legs still felt wobbly and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Frank apologized profusely the whole way, but I barely heard him. My mind was reeling, replaying those awful moments over and over. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about that day sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that rifle barrel pointing at me seared into my brain. I haven't been able to bring myself to go hunting again. My dad says that's okay, that maybe I just need some time. But the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in those woods again. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sets my heart racing. I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, hidden in the trees, someone might be watching me through their scope, finger on the trigger. I know it's not rational. I know it was all just a terrible misunderstanding, but fear doesn't always listen to reason. So for now, I'm sticking to less dangerous hobbies. Maybe someday I'll be ready to pick up a rifle again. But for now, the memory of that terrifying day in the woods is still too fresh, too raw. I never imagined a simple hunting trip could leave such deep scars. But I guess you never know when a normal day might suddenly turn into your worst nightmare. All I can do is be grateful it ended the way it did and try to move forward. But a part of me will always be that scared kid in the woods, certain that at any moment a shot would ring out and end it all. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. My cousin Jake and I were just kids back then, maybe 12 or 13 years old, spending the summer at our grandparents' farm in rural South Carolina. We loved exploring the woods and fields around the property, always on the lookout for new adventures. That particular afternoon in late July was sweltering hot and humid, typical for that time of year. Jake and I had been wandering through the dense forest at the edge of our grandparents' land, pushing deeper into territory we'd never explored before. We were dripping with sweat, swatting at mosquitoes, and starting to get tired and cranky. "Let's head back," I suggested, wiping my forehead with my t-shirt. "Grandma's probably got lunch ready by now." Jake shook his head stubbornly. "Just a little further. I want to see what's over that next hill." I sighed but followed along. Jake always had to push things to the limit. As we crested the hill, something caught my eye through the trees, some kind of tall structure in a small clearing ahead. At first I thought it might be an old water tower or fire lookout. "Hey, check that out," I said, pointing. Jake's eyes lit up with excitement. "Cool! Let's go see what it is." We hurried down the other side of the hill, our fatigue forgotten. As we got closer, I could see it was actually a hunting tower, one of those tall platforms hunters use to get a better vantage point. It looked old and rickety, constructed of weathered wooden beams, but there was something off about it. Even from a distance, I could tell there were strange, lumpy shapes all over the tower, and there was a smell, a sickly, sweet odor that got stronger as we approached. Jake reached the base of the tower first and stopped short. "What the hell?" he muttered. I came up beside him and felt my stomach lurch. The tower was covered in dead dogs, dozens of them. Their bodies were wedged between the support beams or draped over the railings. Some looked freshly killed, while others were in advanced stages of decay, just fur and bones. The smell was overwhelming now. I gagged and covered my mouth and nose with my shirt. "Oh, God!" I choked out. "What? How?" Jake just shook his head, his face pale. We both stood there in shock for a few moments, trying to process the horrific scene before us. There had to be at least 30 or 40 dog carcasses on the tower, all breeds and sizes, everything from tiny Chihuahuas to big German Shepherds. Some were so decomposed I could see maggots crawling through the remaining tissue. Others looked like they'd only been dead a day or two. But the most disturbing part was how meticulously they'd been arranged. This wasn't just a dumping ground. Someone had deliberately positioned each dog's body, wedging them into the beams or draping them artfully over railings, and they went all the way up to the very top of the tower, at least 30 feet high. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered urgently. "Now." I nodded, still too stunned to speak. We turned and started to hurry away, but then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the snap of a twig behind us. We both whirled around, hearts pounding. For a split second I was terrified we'd see some deranged person emerge from the trees. But there was nothing there, just the tower of dead dogs looming silently. That was enough to send us sprinting back towards our grandparents' property. We ran as fast as we could through the woods, branches whipping our faces, not daring to look back. It felt like something was chasing us the whole way. But when we finally burst out of the tree line onto the farm, we were alone. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. Jake and I looked at each other, both shaken to the core. "What do we do?" I finally managed to ask between gulps of air. Jake shook his head. "I don't know. Tell Grandpa? Call the police?" But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Who would believe us? 2 kids claiming they found a tower full of dead dogs deep in the woods? It sounded insane. Maybe we should just forget about it," I said hesitantly. "Pretend we never saw it." Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, you're right. No one would believe us anyway. So that's what we did. We never told anyone about what we saw that day. We avoided that part of the woods for the rest of the summer. When school started again, we tried our best to forget it had ever happened. but I never could shake the memory completely. It haunted my nightmares for years. Even now, 2 decades later, I still get chills thinking about that tower of death we stumbled upon. I've tried researching it since then, looking for any news stories or reports about missing dogs in the area. But I've never found anything concrete. It's like that tower and all those poor animals never existed. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined the whole thing, if the heat and our overactive imaginations conjured up some shared delusion. But then I remember the smell, the sight of all those lifeless bodies arranged with such twisted care, the feeling of absolute terror as we ran through the woods. It was all too real. I've thought about going back to try and find it again, to get proof and finally report it to authorities. But I'm scared of what I might find, or what might find me. What if whoever was responsible is still out there? What if they've been adding to their grotesque collection all these years? So I've kept quiet, carried this secret for over 20 years now. But it weighs on me. Those poor animals deserved better. They deserved justice. Maybe by sharing this story now, someone will recognize it. Maybe someone else has seen that tower. Or maybe it will stay buried in those woods forever, a nightmare that only my cousin and I know about. All I know is that I'll never forget that day. The day 2 curious kids stumbled upon true horror hiding in the Carolina woods. The image of that tower of dead dogs is seared into my memory forever. We chose a remote campground about 3 hours from home, nestled deep in the woods near a picturesque lake. When we arrived that Friday afternoon, I was struck by how peaceful and secluded it felt. There were only a handful of other campers scattered around, mostly retirees in RVs. We found a nice spot to set up our tent, surrounded by tall pines that provided plenty of shade. The first day went great. We went hiking, had a picnic by the lake, and roasted marshmallows over the campfire that night. The kids were having a blast, free from their usual tablets and video games. My wife and I were finally able to relax and unwind after weeks of stress at work. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel off. As I was making breakfast at our campsite, I noticed a beat-up old trailer had pulled into the spot across from us sometime during the night. It looked ancient and run down, covered in rust and dents. But what really caught my eye was the man standing outside it, staring in our direction. He was tall and gaunt, probably in his 50s, with scraggly gray hair and a patchy beard. He wore dirty, ragged clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame, but it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They had an intense, almost feverish look as they followed my children's every move while they played. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But throughout the day, I kept noticing the man lurking at the edges of our campsite, always watching us. He never approached or said anything, just observed from a distance with those unnerving eyes. My wife noticed too and whispered to me, "That guy gives me the creeps. He keeps staring at the kids." I nodded grimly. "I know. Let's just keep them close and hope he leaves soon." But he didn't leave. As night fell, I saw him pacing back and forth by his trailer, muttering to himself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right about this guy. We had the kids go to bed early in the tent while my wife and I stayed up by the fire, both of us on edge. Around 11 p.m. I heard rustling in the woods behind our site. Shining my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of the man ducking behind a tree, trying to hide. "Hey!" I shouted. "What are you doing over there?" He emerged from the shadows, hands raised. "Sorry, friend. Just taking a nighttime stroll. Didn't mean to startle you." His voice was raspy and unsettling. "Well, this is private property," I lied, trying to sound authoritative. "You need to go back to your own site." He nodded and shuffled off, but I could feel his eyes boring into my back as he left. After that, there was no way I could sleep. I sat up all night by the dying fire, jumping at every snapping twig or owl hoot. I kept imagining I saw his silhouette moving through the trees, but told myself it was just shadows playing tricks on me. As dawn broke, I finally relaxed a bit, figuring we had made it through the night safely. I dozed off for maybe 20 minutes. When I jerked awake, my blood ran cold. The man was standing just a few feet away, right at the edge of our campsite, staring at our tent where the kids were still sleeping. I leapt up, adrenaline coursing through me. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. "Get away from here." He didn't react at first, just kept staring at the tent. Then slowly, he turned to me with a twisted smile. "Such pretty children," he rasped. "So innocent. So perfect." I saw red. I charged at him, ready to tackle this creep to the ground, but he was surprisingly quick for his age and darted away into the woods before I could reach him. By now, my wife had emerged from the tent, looking terrified. "What's going on?" she asked. "Pack up everything now," I said urgently. "We're getting out of here." As we hurriedly broke down our campsite, I kept watch for any sign of the man. He seemed to have vanished, but I knew he was out there somewhere, watching. The kids were confused and groggy, not understanding why we were leaving so abruptly. Just as we were about to pull out, I realized I had left my wallet back at the fire pit. I ran to grab it, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were small footprints in the dirt leading from the woods directly to our tent. Adult footprints, much too big to be our kids. He had been right outside the tent while we slept. I sprinted back to the car, threw it into drive, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the man emerging from the tree line, waving goodbye with that awful smile. We drove for an hour in tense silence before finally stopping at a diner to regroup. Over coffee, my wife and I tried to process what had happened. Should we call the police? Would they even believe us? We had no proof of any actual crime, just a lot of creepy behavior. In the end, we decided to just be grateful we had gotten out of there safely. But something still nagged at me. On a hunch, I looked up sex offender registries for that area on my phone. Sure enough, there he was, convicted 20 years ago of multiple counts of child abduction and abuse. He had been out of prison for 2 years. I felt sick imagining what could have happened if we hadn't left when we did. To this day, I still have nightmares about those hungry eyes watching my children. We've never gone camping again. But the part that disturbs me most? When we got home and unpacked, we found something that hadn't been there before. A small, ragged teddy bear tucked into my daughter's sleeping bag. On its worn fur was pinned a note that simply said, "Soon." I don't know how he got into our tent or when. I don't know what he had planned. And I don't know if he's still out there somewhere waiting. All I know is that every time I see a run-down trailer on the highway or catch a glimpse of a gaunt figure on the street, my heart races, and I pull my children close. Some monsters are all too real, and sometimes they're closer than we ever want to believe. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be just another adventure with my college friends, exploring abandoned places for the thrill of it. We had heard rumors about these old mushroom mines outside of town that had been shut down decades ago. The idea of wandering through dark, damp tunnels filled with who knows what kind of fungus sounded exciting in a morbid sort of way. There were 5 of us that decided to check it out that Saturday afternoon. me, Jake, Tati, Chris, and Lauren. We packed some flashlights, water bottles, and snacks, then piled into Jake's beat-up Subaru for the hour-long drive out to the countryside where the mines were located. The whole way there, we were joking around and speculating about what we might find. Lauren was convinced we'd stumble upon some secret government lab. Chris kept making zombie mushroom jokes. I remember Tati being uncharacteristically quiet, just staring out the window. When I asked if she was okay, she just shrugged and said she had a weird feeling about the place. I brushed it off at the time. We finally arrived at the site around 3 p.m. The entrance to the mines was overgrown and barely visible from the road. We had to push through thick brush to even get to the chain-link fence surrounding the property. There was a no trespassing sign hanging crookedly on the rusted gate, but it had clearly been ignored plenty of times before. The lock was broken, and the gate swung open easily. As we approached the mine entrance, I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The gaping black maw of the tunnel seemed to be swallowing up all the light around it. A dank, earthy smell wafted out, along with a noticeable drop in temperature. We all hesitated for a moment, but our curiosity won out over our apprehension. We clicked on our flashlights and ventured inside. The beams of light barely seemed to penetrate the oppressive darkness. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and our footsteps echoed ominously off the rough stone walls. We could see old rail tracks running along the floor, disappearing into the gloom ahead. At first, we stuck close together, speaking in hushed whispers as if afraid to disturb whatever might be lurking in the shadows. But as we went deeper into the mine, we started to relax a bit. We saw some interesting rock formations, patches of bioluminescent fungus, and even some abandoned mining equipment. It was creepy, but in an exciting way. After about 30 minutes of exploring, we came to a fork in the tunnel. We debated which way to go and ultimately decided to split up. Jake, Chris, and Lauren would take the left path, while Tati and I went right. We agreed to turn back in 15 minutes and meet at the fork again. Tati and I hadn't gone more than 100 yards down our tunnel when things started to get weird. The air suddenly felt thick and heavy, almost staticky. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at Tati and saw her eyes were wide, darting around nervously. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. That's when we saw it, a faint pulsing glow coming from further down the tunnel. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, not the steady beam of a flashlight or the warm flicker of fire. This light seemed alive somehow, expanding and contracting like a heartbeat. We stood frozen, transfixed by the otherworldly sight. Part of me wanted to run, but a stronger force kept me rooted to the spot. The light grew brighter, washing the tunnel in an eerie blue-green hue. I could feel it thrumming through my body, resonating in my chest. Suddenly, Tati grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." The urgency in her voice snapped me out of my trance. We turned and ran back the way we came, our flashlight beams bouncing crazily off the walls. We burst out of the tunnel, gasping for breath. Jake, Chris, and Lauren were already there, looking concerned. "What happened? You guys look like you've seen a ghost," Chris said. Between pants, we tried to explain what we'd seen. The others looked skeptical, but agreed to come check it out with us. We led them back down the right-hand tunnel, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. But when we reached the spot where we'd seen the light, there was nothing, just empty darkness. We searched the area thoroughly, but found no trace of the strange phenomenon. "Are you sure you weren't just seeing things?" Lauren asked gently. "It's pretty disorienting down here." I started to doubt myself. Maybe it had been a hallucination brought on by the creepy atmosphere. But Tati was adamant. "I know what I saw," she insisted. That light was real. As soon as the words left her mouth, a flicker of blue-green illuminated the tunnel for a split second. We all gasped. "Did you see that?" Tati cried. "It responds when I talk about it." Sure enough, every time Tati mentioned the light, it would flash briefly, as if acknowledging its own existence. But it never appeared when the rest of us discussed it. It was like it had some kind of connection to Tati specifically. We were all thoroughly freaked out by this point and decided it was time to leave. As we hurried back toward the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe in the corners of my vision. When we finally emerged into the fading afternoon light, we were shocked to see an unfamiliar car parked next to Jake's Subaru. It was an old station wagon, covered in rust and mud, but there was no sign of the driver or any other people around. "Was that there when we arrived?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Everyone shook their heads. We hadn't seen another soul since we'd gotten there. "Maybe someone else came to explore while we were inside," Chris suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We stood there for a few minutes debating what to do. Should we wait to see if the car's owner returned? Call the police? In the end, our nerves got the better of us, and we decided to just get the hell out of there. As we piled into Jake's car, I saw Tati glance back at the mine entrance. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of that eerie blue-green light deep in the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. The drive home was tense and quiet. We were all trying to process what had happened. I kept replaying the events in my mind, searching for some logical explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something beyond our understanding. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to research the history of the mines, looking for any clues about what we might have experienced. We found some vague references to local legends about strange lights and unexplained disappearances in the area, but nothing concrete. Tati became obsessed with figuring out why the light had responded to her. She wanted to go back, to try to communicate with it further. The rest of us refused. Whatever was in that mine, it felt dangerous to mess with. We never did solve the mystery of what happened that day. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just an elaborate prank or a shared delusion. But deep down, I know what I saw. And late at night, when the world is quiet and dark, I still sometimes see that pulsing blue-green light behind my eyelids, beckoning me back to the depths of the earth. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what we encountered in those abandoned mushroom mines, but I do know that it changed me forever. There are things in this world that defy explanation, forces beyond our comprehension, and sometimes they reach out and touch our lives in ways we can never forget. It was supposed to be a normal hunting trip with the guys. We do this every year, rent a cabin deep in the woods, spend a few days tracking deer and drinking beer around the campfire. Nothing out of the ordinary. This time we picked a really remote spot, about 3 hours' drive from the nearest town. The cabin was pretty basic, just a couple of rooms with bunk beds and a small kitchen area. But it had a nice clearing out front where we could sit around the fire at night. The first couple days were totally normal. We got up early, hiked out to our hunting spots, came back in the afternoon to clean any kills and cook dinner. At night we'd drink and swap stories by the fire. Typical guy stuff. It was the third night when things got weird. We were sitting around the fire as usual, having a few beers. It was probably around 10 p.m. The woods were really dark and quiet. No moon that night. Suddenly we heard this faint drumming sound coming from somewhere in the forest. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then Jake said, You guys hear that? We all went silent and listened. Sure enough, there was a steady drumbeat echoing through the trees. It was pretty far off, but clear as day in the still night air. We looked at each other, confused. Who the hell would be drumming out in the middle of nowhere at night? Probably just some campers having a party, said Mike. But something about it felt off. The rhythm was weird, not like normal music. It had this eerie, primitive quality that made the hairs on my neck stand up. We debated what to do. Part of me just wanted to ignore it and go to bed. But curiosity got the better of us. We decided to hike out and investigate. In hindsight, that was a huge mistake. We grabbed our flashlights and rifles, just in case, and set off in the direction of the sound. As we got closer, the drumming got louder. We could hear chanting too, lots of voices speaking in some language I didn't recognize. After about 20 minutes of hiking, we saw a flickering light through the trees ahead. We slowed down and crept forward as quietly as we could. The chanting was really loud now. We came to the edge of a small clearing, and what I saw there, I still have trouble believing it was real. There were maybe 30 or 40 people, all completely naked. They were dancing in a circle around a huge bonfire. In the center was some kind of altar made of stones. The dancers moved in this weird, jerky way, nothing like normal dancing. Their eyes were rolled back in their heads, and they were chanting in that strange language. The sound sent chills down my spine. Scattered around the clearing were these bizarre wooden statues. They looked ancient, covered in carvings I couldn't make out. There were bowls full of some dark liquid placed in front of them. But the worst part was the altar. There was something on it, but I couldn't quite see what from where we were crouched. Jake whispered, "Holy shit," and started to stand up for a better look. I grabbed his arm to stop him, but it was too late. A twig snapped under his foot. The chanting stopped instantly. Every head in the clearing turned towards us in perfect unison. For a split second, nobody moved. Then all hell broke loose. The dancers started screaming and running towards us. We turned and sprinted back the way we came, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. I could hear them right behind us, still shrieking in that weird language. Branches whipped my face as I ran. My lungs were on fire. I was sure they were going to catch us at any second. We burst out of the trees into the clearing by our cabin. I risked a glance back and saw shadowy figures at the tree line. But they didn't follow us into the open. We slammed the cabin door and started grabbing our stuff. Nobody said a word. We just threw everything into the trucks as fast as we could. I've never been so scared in my life. As we peeled out of there, I swear I could still hear that damn drumming echoing through the trees. We drove for hours, not stopping until we hit the highway. Nobody wanted to be alone, so we got a motel room and stayed up all night, jumping at every sound. The next morning, we tried to talk about what happened, but nobody could agree on the details. It was like our brains couldn't fully process what we'd seen. Jake was the worst. He'd gotten the closest look at the altar. He was pale and shaking and refused to say anything about it. We made a pact not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? But I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. What the hell were those people doing out there? What was that language? And what was on that altar? I've done tons of research trying to make sense of it. The closest thing I can find is accounts of old pagan rituals. But this felt different, more primal, more terrifying. Like we'd stumbled on something ancient and evil that should have stayed buried. I still have nightmares about those naked figures dancing in the firelight, their blank eyes and inhuman movements. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, sure I can hear that drums and chanting. Jake hasn't been the same since that night. He barely leaves his house anymore. When I saw him last month, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. He just kept muttering, "We shouldn't have looked. We weren't supposed to see." I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened out there in those woods. Part of me doesn't want to know, but I can't shake the feeling that we glimpsed something we weren't meant to see, something dangerous. I'm writing this all down partly to get it out of my head, but also as a warning. If you're ever out in the wilderness and hear strange drums or chanting, just turn around and get the hell out of there. Don't look. Don't investigate. You're better off not knowing. Trust me, there are some things in this world that should stay hidden in the dark. I just hope whatever we saw that night stays there too. It started as just another boring Friday night in our small town of Oakville. There's never anything to do here, so my friends and I are always looking for ways to entertain ourselves. Brian, my best friend since kindergarten, had the idea to explore the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. We'd all heard stories about it, how it was supposedly haunted, how weird things happened there. But we figured it was just local legends to scare kids. There were 5 of us that night. Me, Brian, Melissa, Jake, and Chris. We met up around 10 p.m. after our parents had gone to bed. The hospital was about a 20-minute bike ride away, down an old dirt road through the woods. As we pedaled along in the darkness, I started to get a bit nervous. The trees seemed to loom over us, and every snapping twig made me jump. When we finally reached the hospital, I felt a chill go down my spine. Even in the moonlight, I could see how dilapidated it was. Windows broken out, ivy crawling up the walls, roof caving in places. It looked like something out of a horror movie. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," I said hesitantly. But Brian just laughed and called me a chicken. I didn't want to seem scared in front of my friends, so I swallowed my fear and followed them towards the entrance. The front doors were chained shut, but we found a broken window we could climb through. The inside was even creepier than the outside. Our flashlight beams bounced off peeling wallpaper and debris-strewn floors. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. As we made our way deeper into the building, I noticed weird stuff everywhere. Old wheelchairs tipped over in the hallways, faded patient artwork still taped to the walls. But the creepiest thing was when we came across what must have been a children's ward. There were broken toys scattered all over, dolls with missing eyes, blocks with teeth marks in them. It gave me goosebumps. "Guys, I really think we should go," Melissa said, her voice shaky. I agreed with her, but Brian insisted we check out the basement before we left. "That's where the most dangerous patients were kept," he said. Against my better judgment, I went along with it. The stairs creaked ominously as we descended into the darkness. The air felt heavy and damp, and there was a musty smell that made me want to gag. Our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate the gloom. We had only taken a few steps into the basement when we heard it. A low, raspy chuckle coming from the shadows. I froze in terror as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, rail-thin and hunched over. He was wearing a filthy green t-shirt that was splattered with what looked horribly like dried blood. But the worst part was his face. Wild, matted hair, framed sunken eyes that gleamed with a crazed light. "You've come for the feast," he said in a sing-song voice, grinning to reveal yellow, rotting teeth. "Fresh meat for the table." I've never been so terrified in my life. We all screamed and bolted for the stairs. I could hear the man cackling behind us as we ran. In our panic, we got turned around in the maze-like hallways. Every corner we turned, I was terrified we'd run into the man again. Finally, we found the window we'd come in through. We practically dove out of it, scraping ourselves on the broken glass in our desperation to escape. We pedaled home faster than I thought possible, not daring to look back. For days afterwards, I was jumpy and on edge. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's deranged face. We debated whether to tell our parents or the police, but we were afraid we'd get in trouble for trespassing. About a week later, there was a story in the local paper that shed some light on our terrifying encounter. Apparently, a patient had escaped from a psychiatric facility in the next town over several months ago. He'd been surviving in the woods, hunting small animals for food. They found him squatting in the basement of the old hospital, wearing a blood-stained green shirt. I still get chills thinking about how close we came to real danger that night. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't managed to get away. I'll never go near that hospital again, and I've learned my lesson about exploring abandoned buildings. Some places are better left alone. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. The events that unfolded in those woods near my house in rural Canada still haunt me to this day. I was a 20-year-old college student at the time, home for summer break. My parents' house was pretty isolated, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. I'd grown up exploring those woods and knew them like the back of my hand, or so I thought. It was a crisp Saturday morning in early June when I decided to go for a hike. The air was fresh and clean after some overnight rain, and I was eager to get out and clear my head after a stressful semester. I told my mom I'd be back in a few hours and set off down the familiar trail behind our property. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds were chirping, squirrels scampering about. I breathed in the earthy scent of the forest, feeling my stress melt away with each step. About an hour into my hike, I veered off the main trail onto a narrower path I'd explored many times before. That's when things started to feel off. The forest suddenly got quieter. The bird calls stopped. Even the rustling of small animals seemed to cease. An eerie stillness settled over everything. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself I was being silly and pressed on. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint metallic tinkling sound, like a small bell ringing in the distance. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears. There it was again. Tink, tink, tink. It seemed to be coming from somewhere up ahead. My heart started racing. We didn't have any neighbors for miles. Who could be out here ringing a bell? Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me. I crept forward slowly, following the intermittent sound. As I rounded a bend in the path, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There on the ground in a small clearing was a dead badger. But this wasn't any normal dead animal. Its head had been cleanly severed from its body. Both parts lay there in the dirt. No signs of blood or struggle, just a neat surgical cut. And strangest of all, tied around the badger's detached neck was a thin silver chain with a tiny bell. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. Who would do something like this, and why? As if on cue, the little bell gave another soft tink as a breeze rustled the leaves. I turned and ran. I sprinted all the way home, not stopping until I burst through the back door, startling my mom in the kitchen. She took one look at my pale, sweating face and asked what was wrong. I mumbled something about not feeling well and retreated to my room. I didn't know how to even begin explaining what I'd seen. That night I tossed and turned, unable to get the image of that decapitated badger out of my head. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of weird science experiment, or a sick prank by local teens. But deep down, I knew something more sinister was at play. I avoided the woods for the next few days, making excuses to stay inside. But as the week wore on, I started to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had my imagination run wild? I decided I needed to go back, just to prove to myself it wasn't real. So exactly 1 week later, I set out again. The weather couldn't have been more different. Dark clouds loomed overhead, and a steady drizzle was falling. But I was determined to face my fears and put this to rest. I made my way down the same route, my shoes squelching in the mud. The woods seemed even more oppressive in the gloomy weather. When I reached the spot where I'd turned off the main trail before, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, but I steeled myself and pressed on. As I neared the clearing where I'd found the badger, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I emerged into the small open space, dreading what I might see. But nothing. The forest floor was empty. No badger body, no severed head, not even any sign that anything had been there. I let out a shaky laugh of relief. I really had imagined the whole thing. But then I heard it. That same soft tinkling sound. Tink, tink, tink. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from above me. I slowly raised my eyes, terrified of what I might see. There, hanging from a branch about 10 feet up, was the badger. Its body swung gently in the breeze, head still neatly severed, that damn bell tinkling around its neck. I stumbled backwards, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. As I staggered away from the horrific sight, a twig snapped loudly behind me. I whirled around, heart nearly stopping. At first, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. But then, movement caught my eye. A dark figure stood partially hidden behind a large oak about 50 feet away. I couldn't make out any features, just a vaguely human-shaped blackness, but I could feel eyes watching me intently. Panic exploded in my chest. I turned and ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping my face. I could hear footsteps pursuing me, getting closer. The sound of that tiny bell jingling wildly echoed in my ears. I don't know how long I ran. Everything was a blur of terror and adrenaline. Somehow I ended up back on the main trail. I sprinted towards home, certain at any moment I'd feel a hand grab me from behind. When our house finally came into view, I nearly wept with relief. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me and collapsing to the floor. My dad came running, alarmed by the commotion. Between gasping sobs, I managed to choke out that someone was chasing me in the woods. My dad immediately grabbed his shotgun and went to investigate while my mom called the police. They searched the area but found nothing. No strange figures, no dead animals, no bells. Just empty, quiet forest. I know how it sounds. Trust me, I've run it over in my head 1,000 times, trying to come up with a rational explanation. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Something evil was in those woods that day, something that was toying with me, hunting me. I left for college a few weeks later and never set foot in that forest again. My parents still live in that house, and as far as I know, nothing strange has happened since. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there is still waiting, still watching. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint tinkling of a tiny silver bell. According to the stories, there was this old abandoned church on the outskirts of town that was supposedly haunted or cursed or something. People said weird stuff happened there at night. Strange lights, creepy sounds, that kind of thing. We'd all heard about it, but none of us had ever actually been there. Jake thought it would be cool to check it out, and like the dumb teenagers we were, we all agreed it was a great idea. So that Saturday night, the 5 of us, me, Jake, Chris, Matt, and Tyler, piled into Jake's beat-up Jeep, and headed out to find Hell's Church. It was pitch black out there in the country, no streetlights or anything. We were relying on vague directions from Jake's older brother and our phone flashlights to try to find this place. After driving around back roads for what felt like hours, we finally spotted it. A decrepit old church, barely visible through the trees, its steeple silhouetted against the night sky. My heart started racing as we pulled up to it. The whole place had an eerie vibe that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We got out of the Jeep and stood there for a minute, psyching ourselves up to actually go inside. That's when Tyler noticed something weird. There was a dirt road leading off behind the church that wasn't on any of our maps. We figured, what the hell, we'd come this far, might as well see where it went. Jake drove us down this bumpy, overgrown road for about 10 minutes until we came to a clearing. There were 3 old buildings there, barely visible in the moonlight. They looked like they might have been barns or warehouses at some point, but they were run down and clearly abandoned now. We sat there debating whether to check them out or head back. Part of me wanted to leave. This whole situation was starting to feel really off. But of course, we couldn't resist exploring further. We were too curious and too stupid to turn back now. We decided to split up and each take a building. I went with Chris to the one on the far left. The door was hanging half off its hinges, and it made this horrible creaking sound as we pushed it open. The smell hit us immediately, musty and damp, with something else I couldn't place. We clicked on our flashlights and stepped inside. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. The building was filled with bicycles. Dozens and dozens of kids' bicycles, all sizes, piled up everywhere. Some looked almost new, others were rusted and falling apart, but they were all clearly children's bikes. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications started to sink in. Why were there so many kids' bikes out here in the middle of nowhere? Where did they come from? What happened to the children who once rode them? Chris and I looked at each other in horror. Without saying a word, we turned and ran out of there as fast as we could. We started yelling for the others to get back to the Jeep now. As we all scrambled to get in, I heard the sound of an engine roaring to life nearby. Headlights suddenly blinded us as this massive black truck came tearing out from behind one of the other buildings. It was heading straight for us. Jake floored it, peeling out of there with the truck in hot pursuit. I've never been so terrified in my life as I was during that chase. This huge truck was right on our tail, engine roaring, trying to run us off the road. Jake was driving like a maniac, swerving all over the place, trying to lose them. At one point, the truck managed to pull up alongside us. I caught a glimpse of the driver, a huge, hulking figure, wearing what looked like some kind of mask. He turned and looked right at me, and I swear I felt my heart stop for a second. Somehow, Jake managed to pull ahead, and we eventually lost them once we got back to the main road. We drove straight home, not saying a word the whole way. We were all in shock, trying to process what the hell just happened. To this day, I still don't know what was really going on out there. Were those bikes trophies from missing kids? Was it all an elaborate hoax? I've tried researching it since then, but I've never found any solid answers. All I know is that the memory of those bikes and that terrifying chase still haunts me. I've never gone back there, and I never will. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'm 14, and I often babysit for my aunt and uncle who live in a pretty remote area in the mountains of Pennsylvania. Their house is pretty isolated, surrounded by dense forest. Usually I love the peace and quiet out there, but that night It felt eerie and oppressive. My aunt and uncle had gone out for a rare date night, leaving me to watch their 3 kids, ages 8, 6, and 4. Everything was normal at first. We had dinner, watched some TV, and I got the younger 2 to bed around 8:30. The oldest, Tommy, was allowed to stay up a bit later. It was around 9:45 when things started to feel off. I had this creeping sense of unease, like we were being watched. I tried to shake it off as just my imagination running wild in the dark, quiet house. But I couldn't stop glancing out the windows into the pitch-black night. Tommy must have sensed my nervousness. He asked if everything was okay, and I plastered on a fake smile, assuring him it was fine. I suggested we play a board game to distract ourselves. As we set it up, I heard a faint sound from outside, like footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart started racing. I casually went to check that all the doors and windows were locked. As I peered out the front window, my blood ran cold. There was a large, shadowy figure moving around near the edge of the woods. I blinked hard, praying I was seeing things, but when I looked again, there were now 2 figures. Trying not to panic, I told Tommy we were going to play a fun hiding game. I quickly ushered him upstairs and got all 3 kids into the master bedroom closet, which had a lock. I grabbed my aunt's cell phone, relieved to see it had signal. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but it would take at least 20 minutes given our location. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I stayed on the line, whispering updates as I heard the intruders trying different doors and windows. Suddenly there was a loud bang from the basement. They were trying to break in through the cellar doors. I heard wood splintering and knew they'd be inside soon. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the phone, praying the police would arrive in time. Heavy footsteps creaked on the basement stairs. I held my breath, trying to silence my pounding heart. The kids were remarkably quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation. A deep voice called out, "We know you're in here. Just come out and nobody gets hurt." I froze in terror. The voice sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. More footsteps, now on the main floor. Drawers and cabinets being opened and slammed shut. They were looking for something specific. I heard them start up the stairs, and I thought I might pass out from fear. They were so close now. I could hear their labored breathing, smell cigarette smoke and sweat. Just then, blessed blue and red lights flashed outside. Sirens blared, shattering the tense silence. I heard panicked swearing and the thunder of footsteps racing back downstairs. By the time police entered, the intruders had fled back into the woods. The next hour was a blur of police questions and my aunt and uncle rushing home. As I recounted what happened, one of the officers looked troubled. He asked if I could describe the men at all. I mentioned the voice I'd heard and how one was very large with red hair and a beard. The officer exchanged a significant look with my uncle. That's when I realized why the voice had seemed familiar. It was Mr. Jim, an old family friend I'd met at cookouts years ago. Later, I learned the full story. My uncle had gotten mixed up with drugs, owing money to some very bad people. Mr. Jim was sent to collect by any means necessary. They assumed the house would be empty and planned to ransack it for valuables. I'm still processing everything that happened that night. I have nightmares and panic attacks, especially when I'm alone in the dark. But I'm also proud that I managed to keep the kids safe. I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly secure again, but I'm trying to move forward one day at a time. I can't help wondering, what if the police had been a few minutes later? What if the intruders had found us hiding? The what-ifs haunt me, but I'm grateful it didn't end tragically. Sometimes I think I see Mr. Jim's bearded face in crowds, or hear his gravelly voice in public places. My aunt and uncle moved shortly after the incident, but I still get nervous in isolated areas. The whole experience feels surreal, like a nightmare I can't fully wake up from. I keep expecting to find out it was all just a bad dream. But then I remember the paralyzing fear, the sound of wood breaking, the acrid smell of cigarettes, and I know it was all too real. I've started seeing a therapist to help process the trauma. She says it's normal to have lingering anxiety and hypervigilance after an event like that. I'm working on grounding techniques and positive self-talk. My relationship with my aunt and uncle is strained now. I love them, but I'm angry they put us in that dangerous situation, even unintentionally. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully trust them again. I've become much more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I'm always planning escape routes and checking for exits. My friends think I'm paranoid, but they don't understand what it's like to feel that level of fear and helplessness. Sometimes I wonder about Mr. Jim. How did he go from being a family friend to someone capable of threatening children? Was he always dangerous and we just didn't see it? Or did desperation and drugs change him that much? I'll probably never know. I still babysit occasionally, but only for families in my neighborhood now. I'm not ready to be alone in a remote area again. Maybe someday I'll feel safe enough, but for now I'm taking it one day at a time. Writing this all out has been cathartic in a way. It helps to get the story out of my head, where it's been swirling for months. If anyone else has been through something similar, know that you're not alone. It does get easier with time and support. I'm trying to focus on the positives. I kept the kids safe. I stayed calm enough to call for help. I survived. But some days are harder than others. The sound of footsteps outside still makes my heart race. I've started learning self-defense, which helps me feel more empowered. I know realistically it wouldn't have helped much in that situation, but it makes me feel less helpless now. My parents have been incredibly supportive through all of this. They've never pushed me to babysit again or made me feel weak for struggling. Their unconditional love and understanding has been my rock. As terrifying as that night was, I'm trying to use it as motivation to be stronger and braver. I don't want fear to control my life. I'm determined to reclaim my sense of safety and not let those men have power over me anymore. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to trust your instincts. If something feels off, listen to that feeling. It might just save your life. I'm grateful every day that I acted on my unease instead of ignoring it. I hope sharing my story helps someone else feel less alone or encourages them to be vigilant. You never think something like this will happen to you, but it can. Stay safe out there, and remember, you're stronger than you know. It was a Tuesday afternoon in August, and I had the day off work. I decided to head to the Lowe's near my apartment in Charleston to grab some paint and brushes for touching up my living room. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed it wasn't very busy, just a handful of cars scattered around. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I wish there had been more people around. I grabbed a cart and headed inside, making my way towards the paint section. As I was browsing the color swatches, I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I glanced around and noticed an employee standing at the end of the aisle, staring in my direction. He was a tall, thin man, probably in his 40s, with greasy dark hair and pale, sallow skin. Something about his gaze made me uncomfortable, so I quickly looked away and tried to focus on picking out my paint colors. A few minutes later, I felt someone come up right behind me. Before I could turn around, I heard a low voice practically in my ear whisper, "Can I help you find anything delicious?" I jumped and spun around to see the same creepy employee standing way too close, an unsettling smile on his face. My heart started racing as I stammered out, "No thanks, I'm fine." He just kept staring at me with those beady eyes as I grabbed a few paint cans and hurried to the next aisle. I tried to shake off the encounter and concentrate on finding the rest of my supplies, but I kept noticing the same guy hovering nearby, always watching me. Every time I looked up, there he was, at the end of the aisle, or pretending to stock shelves, but his eyes never left me. I started to feel panicky and decided to just grab what I needed and get out of there as fast as possible. As I was speed walking towards the checkout, he suddenly appeared in front of me, blocking my path. "Leaving so soon, Emily?" he asked in that same creepy whisper. My blood ran cold. I hadn't given my name to anyone in the store. How did he know who I was? "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to go around him. But he sidestepped to stay in front of me. "You can't leave yet," he said, his voice taking on a menacing tone. "We have so much more to discuss, like that cute little house you live in on Maple Street, the blue one with the red door." I felt like I was going to throw up. This guy knew where I lived? How was that possible? I'd never seen him before in my life. "Please leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm going to call security." He chuckled, a chilling sound. "Oh, Emily, there's no one here who can help you. It's just you and me." He reached out as if to touch my face, and I flinched back, my cart clattering to the ground. In that split second of distraction, I bolted. I ran as fast as I could towards the exit, leaving my cart and all my stuff behind. I could hear his footsteps pounding after me. I burst out of the automatic doors and sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. Just as I got the door open, I saw him emerge from the store. Our eyes met, and he gave me the most evil smile I've ever seen. I dove into my car, slammed the door, and peeled out of the parking lot with screeching tires. The whole drive home, I was in a panic, constantly checking my rearview mirror to make sure he wasn't following me. When I got to my street, I drove right past my house, terrified that he really did know where I lived. I ended up parked in a busy grocery store lot, hyperventilating and sobbing. It took me over an hour to calm down enough to drive home. I went straight inside and locked every door and window. I called the police to report what happened, but they basically told me there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't actually touched me or explicitly threatened me. They said they'd send a patrol car by Lowe's to check things out, but I never heard anything back. For days afterwards, I was a complete wreck. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every little sound. I kept all the curtains drawn and barely left the house. I ended up taking a week off work because I was too scared to go anywhere. I still have no idea how that man knew my name or where I lived. The police said there was no employee matching his description working at that Lowe's. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the store a couple weeks later, none of the staff seemed to know who I was talking about. It's been almost a month now, and I'm still not back to normal. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified I'll see him again. I've started seeing a therapist to deal with the anxiety and paranoia. I've considered moving, but part of me is afraid he'll just find me again somehow. I don't know if he was some kind of stalker who had been watching me, or if something even more sinister was going on. All I know is that those 20 minutes in Lowe's were the most terrifying of my life, and I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Trust your instincts if someone gives you a bad feeling, and don't hesitate to ask for help. I'll forever regret not immediately going to find a manager or security guard when that creep first approached me. I keep replaying that day over and over, wondering if there were signs I missed or things I should have done differently. The way he seemed to appear out of nowhere, how he knew details about my life, that evil smile as I drove away. It all feels so surreal, like a nightmare I can't wake up from. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of work and life just caused me to have some kind of breakdown. But then I remember the pure terror I felt, the way my hands shook as I tried to get my car key in the lock, the sound of his footsteps chasing me through the store. It was all too real. I've become paranoid about going anywhere alone now. I make my boyfriend come with me to run even simple errands. I've installed a security system and cameras all around my house. I jump every time the phone rings or there's a knock at the door. Part of me knows I can't live like this forever, constantly afraid and on edge. But another part of me feels like my sense of safety has been permanently shattered. How can I ever feel secure again, knowing there are people out there capable of such creepy, invasive behavior? I'm trying to take things one day at a time and slowly regain my confidence, but I don't think I'll ever forget that day at Lowe's, or the face of that man who seemed to know way too much about me. I hope by sharing my story, I can warn others to be vigilant and trust their instincts. You never know when a mundane errand might turn into a terrifying encounter that changes your life forever. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another customer, right? But then I started noticing him. Every single shift. He'd come in, order nothing, and just sit there, staring at me, for hours. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I remember the day it really started to freak me out. It was a Tuesday, and we were pretty slow. I was wiping down the counter when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up, and there he was, sitting in the corner, those intense eyes fixed on me. I quickly looked away, my heart racing. When I glanced back a few minutes later, he was still staring, unblinking, unmoving, just watching. I mentioned it to my coworker, Jake. "That guy gives me the creeps," I whispered. Jake looked over and frowned. "Yeah, he's been here a lot lately. Want me to say something?" I shook my head. What could we really do? He wasn't breaking any rules. But as the days went on, his presence became more and more oppressive. I started dreading going to work, my stomach in knots every time I put on my apron. One day, about 3 weeks in, things escalated. I was heading to the bathroom during my break when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was, following me down the narrow hallway. My heart nearly stopped. "Excuse me," I managed to squeak out. "This is for employees only." He didn't say a word, just stood there blocking my path, his eyes boring into me. I felt trapped, cornered. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly turned and walked away. I ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and tried not to hyperventilate. What the hell was happening? From that day on, it was like he was everywhere. I'd see him on the street when I was walking home. He'd be sitting in his car across from the coffee shop when I arrived for my morning shift. Once, I even spotted him at the grocery store, lurking at the end of an aisle as I shopped. I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time the bell above the coffee shop door chimed, I'd jump. My coworkers noticed the change in me. "You okay?" they'd ask. But how could I explain? I felt like I was losing my mind. Then came the day that pushed me over the edge. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and the shop was packed. I was in the zone, pumping out drinks as fast as I could, when I happened to glance up at the window. And there he was, standing in the pouring rain, staring at me. But this time he had something in his hand, a piece of paper. As I watched, frozen in horror, he slowly pressed it against the glass. It was a purple heart, crudely drawn, dripping in the rain, but unmistakable and terrifying. I dropped the cup I was holding, hot coffee splashing everywhere. My manager rushed over, asking what was wrong. Through tears, I pointed at the window, but when we looked, he was gone, just like that, vanished into the rainy night. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. With shaking hands, I called the police. They came, took my statement, but seemed skeptical. "We'll look into it," they said, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. No crime had been committed after all, just a creepy guy and a scared barista. But I knew this wasn't just some harmless crush or misunderstanding. The look in his eyes, the relentless pursuit, the heart on the window, it all added up to something sinister, something dangerous. I filed a police report, but it felt futile. What could they really do? I considered quitting my job, but why should I have to uproot my life because of this creep? Plus, I was afraid that if I left, he'd find some other way to stalk me. At least at the coffee shop, I was surrounded by people, so I stayed. But I changed my routines. I varied my routes to and from work. I asked co-workers to walk me to my car. I bought pepper spray and a personal alarm. I became hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, always on edge. For a week after the incident with the heart, he didn't show up. I started to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd moved on. But then, yesterday, as I was locking up the shop, I saw him, standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror. He was smiling. Now, as I sit here typing this, I'm terrified. I don't know what to do. The police can't help. My friends and family are concerned, but they can't be with me 24/7. I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare that I can't wake up from. Every noise makes me jump. Every stranger on the street could be him. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to appear. The worst part is not knowing what he wants. Why me? What does he plan to do? I'm sharing this because I need help. I need advice. I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy, that this is real and dangerous. Because right now, I feel like I'm drowning in fear, and I don't know how much longer I can keep my head above water. To anyone reading this, please be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And if you're going through something similar, don't stay silent. Speak up, reach out for help, because no one should have to live in fear like this. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Will he be there when I open the shop? Will he escalate further? I'm scared to find out, but I also know I can't let him win. I can't let him control my life. So I'll go to work tomorrow. I'll make coffee, smile at customers, and try to act normal. But inside, I'll be terrified, watching, waiting, wondering if today will be the day he makes his move. If anyone has any advice, please share. I'm desperate for help, for a way out of this nightmare. Because right now, I feel like I'm trapped in a horror movie of my own life, and I have no idea how it's going to end. I'm a long-haul trucker. Been doing this job for over 15 years now. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the lonely highways late at night, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered at that godforsaken rest stop. It was around 2 a.m., and I had been driving for about 10 hours straight. I was starting to get pretty drowsy, so I decided to pull over at the next rest area to catch a few hours of sleep. The exit sign indicated there was a rest stop coming up in 5 miles, so I set my sights on making it there. As I pulled off the highway, I immediately got an uneasy feeling. The rest area was completely deserted, which wasn't too unusual given the time of night. But there was something off about the place. It was eerily silent. No crickets chirping, no distant sound of traffic, nothing, just dead silence. I parked my rig and shut off the engine. The silence was almost deafening at that point. I tried to shake off the creepy vibes and get some rest. I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, figuring I was just on edge from driving all night. I must have dozed off for a bit, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by what sounded like whispering coming from outside the truck. At first I thought I was dreaming, but as I became more alert, I could definitely hear hushed voices. My heart started racing. Who the hell would be out there at this hour? I peered out the windows but couldn't see anyone in the dim lighting of the rest area. The whispering continued, sounding like it was coming from multiple sources all around the truck. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened the door, scanning the area as I climbed down from the cab. The whispers immediately stopped as soon as my feet hit the pavement. I did a slow 360, shining my light in all directions, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, I caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the wooded area behind the rest stop. I froze, my blood running cold. In the beam of my flashlight, I could make out a group of maybe 8 or 10 figures standing in a circle. They were wearing long, dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces. I stood there paralyzed, unable to process what I was seeing. Were they some kind of cult? As my eyes adjusted, I realized with horror that they were all wearing blank white masks under their hoods. They seemed to be chanting something, but I couldn't make out the words. Their voices were low and guttural, almost inhuman sounding. I knew I should run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, as if synchronized, every hooded figure turned to face me at once. The chanting stopped abruptly. Even from a distance, I could feel their eyes boring into me from behind those emotionless masks. One of the figures, wearing a green robe instead of black, slowly raised its arm and pointed directly at me. That's when panic finally overcame my paralysis. I turned and ran for my truck as fast as my legs would carry me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to get the door open. Just as I managed to unlock it, I heard footsteps rapidly approaching behind me. I didn't dare look back, just dove into the cab and slammed the door shut. My fingers trembled as I tried to get the key in the ignition. I could hear them outside now, their whispers growing louder, more frenzied. Something slammed against the side of the truck, rocking it violently. Finally, the engine roared to life. I threw it in drive and floored it, tires squealing as I peeled out of that godforsaken rest stop. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of the robed figures standing in the road, watching me speed away. I drove for hours without stopping, my heart pounding the whole time. Every shadow on the road made me flinch. I kept expecting to see those blank masks appear in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until the sun started coming up that I finally began to calm down. I pulled over at a busy truck stop, surrounded by other rigs and people. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks. I've been trying to rationalize what happened ever since. Maybe I hallucinated the whole thing from sleep deprivation. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Those robed figures, that inhuman chanting, the way they all turned to face me in unison. It seared into my brain. I looked up the location of that rest stop later. Turns out there have been other reports of strange occurrences there over the years. Truckers talk about hearing whispers, seeing shadowy figures. Some refuse to stop there altogether. I don't know what the hell I stumbled upon that night. Some kind of cult ritual? Something even worse? All I know is I'm never setting foot in that rest area again as long as I live. I've warned every trucker I know to avoid it like the plague. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I still hear those whispers carried on the wind. I see those blank masks staring at me from the darkness beyond my headlights. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe on the road again after what I experienced. To any other truckers out there reading this, stay far away from that cursed rest stop. And if you're ever driving through the Midwest in the dead of night and get the urge to pull over, just keep on driving. You never know what kind of evil might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to wander into its grasp. I'll carry the terror of that night with me for the rest of my life. The image of that green-robed figure pointing at me is burned into my mind. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like they're still out there, searching for me. I just pray I never cross paths with them again. Stay safe out there, fellow truckers, and always trust your gut if a place gives you a bad feeling. You might just be saving yourself from an encounter with something beyond human understanding. I'd been there for about an hour, nursing a gin and tonic, when this guy sat down next to me. He was tall, well-dressed, and had this charming smile. We got to talking, and he seemed really sweet and funny. After a few drinks, I was actually starting to feel better for the first time in weeks. When he suggested we go back to his place, I hesitated at first. But I was lonely, and he was cute, so I figured why not. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that little voice telling me to be careful. As soon as we got to his apartment, things felt off. He got really intense and pushy. I tried to slow things down, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. I ended up having to physically push him off me and practically run out of there. I was shaken up but told myself it was just a bad hookup and tried to forget about it. A few days later, I started getting these weird texts from unknown numbers. At first, they seemed random. "Hope you're having a good day," or "That red dress looks great on you." I ignored them, figuring they were spam or wrong numbers. But then they got more specific. "How was lunch with your mom yesterday? Congrats on the promotion at work." It was freaky because I hadn't told anyone about my promotion yet. I started to get paranoid, wondering if someone was following me. I'd catch glimpses of someone who looked like the guy from the bar, but when I turned to look again, they'd be gone. I told myself I was being silly, that I was just on edge from the breakup and the bad date. Then came my 25th birthday. My friends threw me a surprise party at this cute little bar in D.C. I was having an amazing time, finally feeling like myself again after months of sadness. We were all laughing and dancing when I looked up and saw him. The guy from the bar was there, staring at me from across the room. My blood ran cold. How did he know where I'd be? How did he even know it was my birthday? I must have looked terrified because my friend Amy rushed over to ask what was wrong. When I pointed him out, her husband Mark immediately went into protective mode. He's this big, intimidating ex-military guy. He marched right up to the stalker and got in his face. I couldn't hear what was said, but the guy looked scared and practically ran out of the bar. After that night, I was a mess. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd jump. I changed my number, but somehow he kept getting new ones to text me from. I'd wake up to find dozens of messages, each one more disturbing than the last. He knew things about my childhood, about my family, details I'd never shared with anyone. I decided I had to move. I packed up my apartment and crashed on Amy and Mark's couch while I looked for a new place. But even that didn't stop him. Flowers would show up at my work. I'd come out to my car to find notes tucked under the windshield wiper. The final straw came when I was out grocery shopping. I was in the produce section when I felt someone breathing down my neck. I spun around and there he was, inches from my face. He smiled and said, "Happy 6-month anniversary, baby." I dropped everything and ran out of the store, shaking and crying. That's when I knew I had to get the police involved. I went straight to the station and filed for a restraining order. The officer I spoke to was incredibly kind and patient as I sobbed through my story. She helped me document everything, the texts, the gifts, every single incident I could remember. It's been a few weeks now since the order was granted. The texts have stopped, and I haven't seen him around. But I still don't feel safe. I jump at every sound, check over my shoulder constantly. I'm seeing a therapist to try and work through the trauma, but it's hard. How do you move on when your sense of safety and privacy has been so thoroughly violated? I keep asking myself how this happened. How did he get so much information about me? Was it all just from that one night? Did he hack my phone somehow? I may never know, and that's almost the scariest part. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, listen to that feeling. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, don't wait to get help. Document everything and go to the authorities. No one should have to live in fear like this. I'm trying to rebuild my life now. I've moved to a new city, started a new job. But I still look over my shoulder. I still wonder if he's out there, watching, waiting. Will I ever feel truly safe again? I don't know. But I'm determined to try. I refuse to let him win, to let him control my life any longer. It's a daily struggle, but I'm fighting, and I hope that by sharing my story, maybe I can help someone else avoid going through what I did. I worked the night shift at McDonald's in Antillon, a small town in England. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills while I figure out what I want to do with my life. That night was like any other. I clocked out around 1 a.m. and started my usual walk home. The streets were quiet and empty, just the occasional car passing by. I was about halfway home when I first noticed him. Just a guy walking on the opposite side of the street, nothing unusual. But then he crossed over to my side and started walking in the same direction as me, matching my pace. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few minutes later, he called out to me. "Hey there! Nice night for a walk, isn't it?" His tone was friendly enough, but it made my skin crawl. I mumbled a quick, "Yeah," and picked up my pace, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. Instead, he jogged a bit to catch up with me. "I'm Tom," he said, falling into step beside me. "What's your name?" I hesitated, not wanting to engage, but also not wanting to be rude in case I was overreacting. "Emma," I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed ahead. "Nice to meet you, Emma. Do you live around here? I haven't seen you before." His questions were starting to make me really uncomfortable. I gave a vague nod, trying to end the conversation. But he kept talking, asking about my job, if I had a boyfriend, what I liked to do for fun. With each question, my anxiety ratcheted up a notch. I was about 2 blocks from my apartment when things took a turn. Out of nowhere, he reached out to put his arm around my shoulders. "Come on, Emma, don't be shy," he said with a laugh that made my blood run cold. I jerked away from him, my heart pounding. "Please don't touch me," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to go home now." His face changed then, the friendly mask slipping for just a second. There was something dark in his eyes that made me want to run, but I was afraid that if I ran, he'd chase me. So I kept walking, faster now, praying I'd make it to my building before anything happened. He kept pace with me, his tone shifting to something more aggressive. "What's your problem? I'm just being friendly. You should be flattered that I'm talking to you." I didn't respond, focusing all my energy on getting to my apartment as quickly as possible. When my building finally came into view, I felt a surge of relief. But as I approached the entrance, I realized with horror that he was still right behind me. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. "Hey, where are you going? The night's still young," he said, reaching for my arm. I yanked away from him and practically ran to the door, jamming my key into the lock. Just as I got the door open, I felt his hand on my shoulder. "Don't be like that, Emma. Let me come up for a bit." In that moment, pure adrenaline took over. I shoved the door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut behind me, hearing the lock click into place. Through the glass, I could see him standing there, a look of anger twisting his features. He pounded on the door a few times, shouting something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own panicked breathing. I ran up the stairs to my third-floor apartment, not daring to look back. Only when I was safely inside with the door locked and bolted did I allow myself to break down. I collapsed on the floor, sobbing and shaking uncontrollably. For hours, I sat huddled against the door, jumping at every little sound, convinced he'd somehow found a way into the building. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, wondering if I'd overreacted or if I'd narrowly escaped something truly terrible. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of walking those same streets again. I spent the day researching pepper spray and self-defense classes, feeling angry at myself for being so vulnerable and angry at the world for making me feel this way. It's been a month, and I still haven't walked home alone at night since then. I take cabs or ask coworkers for rides, even though it's stretching my already tight budget. Every time I see a man walking alone at night, my heart races, and I have to remind myself to breathe. The worst part is, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. That night shattered my sense of security in a way I never expected. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there watching me, waiting for another opportunity. I know some people might say I'm overreacting, that nothing really happened. But the fear I felt that night was real. The look in his eyes when I rejected him was real, and the relief I felt when that door closed between us was definitely real. I'm sharing this because I want other women to be aware of the dangers that can lurk in even the most mundane situations. Trust your instincts. Don't worry about being polite if something feels off. And always, always have a plan to get yourself to safety. I don't know if I'll ever see that man again, or if he's done this to other women in town. But I do know that I'll never forget that night, or the valuable lesson it taught me about the importance of staying vigilant and prioritizing my own safety above all else. To any women reading this who have been through something similar, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, please be careful out there. The world can be a scary place, especially for young women just trying to make their way home after a long night at work. I'm still processing what happened, still trying to find ways to feel safe in my own city again. But I'm also determined not to let fear control my life. I'm looking into self-defense classes and considering adopting a dog for companionship and protection. Slowly but surely, I'm reclaiming my sense of security. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my experience, it's this: trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't be afraid to be rude or cause a scene if it means keeping yourself safe. Your safety is more important than anyone's hurt feelings or bruised ego. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help even one person avoid a similar situation. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, you're stronger than you think. On this particular night, I left my flat around 10 p.m. as usual for my 11 p.m. shift. The streets were quiet and dimly lit as I made my way towards the hospital. About halfway there, I noticed a car slow down beside me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then the driver rolled down his window and called out to me. "Hey there, you heading to the hospital?" he asked in a friendly tone. I was a bit startled, but replied that yes, I was. "Hop in, I can give you a lift," the man offered with a smile. He looked to be in his 40s, clean-cut and normal enough. But something about the situation made me uneasy. I politely declined, saying I preferred to walk. The man insisted, "Come on, it's no trouble. Looks like it might rain soon anyway." I firmly said no thank you again and picked up my pace. The car lingered for a moment before driving off. I breathed a sigh of relief, but felt unsettled for the rest of my walk. I tried to shake it off as I arrived at work and clocked in for my shift. A few hours into my shift, I was restocking medications when my phone buzzed. I glanced at it and froze. There was a text from an unknown number. "Why didn't you want a ride? I was just trying to be nice." My heart started racing. How did this person get my number? I hadn't given it to anyone recently. I decided to ignore it and get back to work, but another text came through. "I know you're at the hospital pharmacy right now. Working the night shift again?" Now I was seriously freaked out. I looked around nervously, half expecting to see the man from the car somehow in the hospital. But the pharmacy was empty, except for me and a nurse picking up some meds. With shaking hands, I texted back, "Who is this? How did you get this number?" The reply came quickly. "Just a friend. I've seen you walking to work a lot. Thought I'd introduce myself properly tonight." I felt sick to my stomach. This person had clearly been watching me, learning my routines. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But what would I even tell them? I had no proof of anything sinister, just some creepy texts. I tried to focus on my work, but I kept jumping at every little noise. When my coworker arrived for the morning shift, I practically ran out of there. The whole way home, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see that car again. For the next few days, I was constantly on edge. I changed up my route to work, took different streets each time, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More texts came, always from different numbers. "New route today? Smart. That blue jacket looks nice on you. How's the night shift going? Must be lonely in there all by yourself." I was a nervous wreck. I barely slept, jumping at every sound in my flat. I considered quitting my job, but I needed the money and was afraid of being unemployed and even more vulnerable. About a week after the initial incident, I was restocking supplies in a storage closet at the far end of the pharmacy when I heard footsteps. Figuring it was just another nurse, I called out, "Be right with you." But when I stepped out of the closet, my blood ran cold. It was him, the man from the car. He was standing there in scrubs with a hospital ID badge, smiling at me like we were old friends. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "Thought I'd stop by and say hello in person since you didn't want that ride." I was frozen in fear, my mind racing. How did he get in here? Was that badge real? Before I could react, he took a step closer. "You know, it's not very nice to ignore someone who's just trying to be friendly," he said, his tone hardening slightly. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we start over?" He reached out as if to shake my hand, and I instinctively backed away, knocking over a cart of supplies. The crash must have alerted security, because I heard running footsteps approaching. The man's face twisted in anger for a split second before he plastered on that fake smile again. "Oops, looks like you had a little accident there. Better clean that up. I'll catch you later." And with that, he turned and walked briskly out of the pharmacy. By the time security arrived, he was gone. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak, but I managed to tell them what happened. They reviewed the security footage, but somehow there was no sign of the man on any of the cameras. After that night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the police and filed a report, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. I ended up switching to day shifts and started driving to work instead of walking. The texts finally stopped, and I haven't seen the man again, but I still look over my shoulder constantly. I've moved flats and changed my phone number, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching and waiting. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Was he just a creep who got off on scaring people? Or did he have something more sinister planned? I'll probably never know, but I'll never forget those terrifying weeks when my life felt like it had turned into a nightmare. Stay safe out there, everyone. You never know who might be watching. It was a pretty quiet night, as most were. The bar crowd had mostly cleared out, and I was just counting down the hours until I could close up shop at 3 a.m. Around 2:30, these two guys stumbled in, clearly wasted. They were both probably in their mid-30s, kind of rough-looking. One of them went to grab some snacks, while the other came up to the counter, fumbling with his wallet. "Hey, sweetheart," he slurred. "You wouldn't happen to know where we could catch a cab around here, would you?" I explained that we didn't really have cab service in our small town, especially not at this hour. The guy looked genuinely distressed. "Shit, how are we going to get home? Our DD bailed on us." His friend joined him at the counter, arms full of chips and candy. "What's the problem?" the second guy asked. The first guy explained the situation. "I don't know what possessed me in that moment. Maybe it was the late hour, or my own exhaustion, or just a misguided desire to help. But I heard myself saying, 'I get off in about 20 minutes. I could give you guys a ride if you need.'" They both lit up at that. "Really? You'd do that for us? You're a lifesaver." I smiled, feeling good about helping out. I told them to hang out for a bit while I finished closing up. As I was counting the till and getting ready to leave, a nagging voice in the back of my head kept saying, this wasn't a great idea, but I pushed it aside. I'd given plenty of drunk friends rides before, and these guys seemed harmless enough. Plus, I figured I was being smart. I had my pepper spray in my purse, and I'd drop them off first before heading home myself. We piled into my beat-up Corolla around 3:15 a.m. The first guy, who introduced himself as Mike, got in the passenger seat to give directions. His friend Dave sprawled out in the back. As we pulled out of the parking lot, Mike started giving me directions to their place. At first, everything seemed fine. We were headed in the general direction of some of the more rural neighborhoods outside of town. But after about 10 minutes of driving, I started to get an uneasy feeling. We were getting pretty far out, on dark country roads I wasn't super familiar with. I tried to keep my voice casual as I asked, "You guys sure live out here in the boonies, huh?" Mike chuckled. "Yeah, we like our privacy." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I noticed Dave in the rearview mirror, staring at me with this intense look that made my blood run cold. My heart started racing as I realized how stupid I'd been. I was alone in a car with two strange men, driving to God knows where in the middle of the night. What the hell had I been thinking? I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "You know what, guys? I just remembered I have an early class tomorrow. I should probably turn back." Mike's hand shot out, gripping my arm. "Now don't go getting cold feet on us, sweetheart. We're almost there." Panic surged through me. I yanked my arm away and slammed on the brakes, ready to jump out of the car. But before I could, Dave lunged forward from the back seat, wrapping his arm around my neck. "Just keep driving," he growled in my ear. "Don't do anything stupid." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. I tried to remember my self-defense classes, but fear had paralyzed me. We were in the middle of nowhere. Even if I screamed, no one would hear me. Mike was giving directions again, telling me to turn down an even darker, narrower road. I could see nothing but dense woods on either side. Tears were streaming down my face as I realized how dire my situation was. But then, like a miracle, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Another car was coming up behind us. It was my chance. Without thinking, I jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending us careening off the road. Mike and Dave both yelled in surprise as we bounced over the uneven ground. I slammed on the brakes and threw the car into park. In the chaos, I managed to hit the door locks and scramble out of the car. I sprinted towards the approaching headlights, waving my arms frantically. I could hear Mike and Dave shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The oncoming car, an old pickup truck, screeched to a halt. An older man rolled down his window, looking concerned. "Please help me," I sobbed. "These men, they were going to—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. The man took one look at my tear-streaked face and the two guys stumbling out of my car and seemed to grasp the situation immediately. "Get in," he said gruffly, reaching across to open the passenger door. I dove in just as Mike and Dave reached the truck. The old man gunned it, leaving them in a cloud of dust. As we sped away, I finally let myself break down, shaking uncontrollably. The man, who introduced himself as Frank, insisted on driving me straight to the police station. I gave my statement in a daze, still not quite believing what had happened. The cops went out to look for Mike and Dave, but of course they were long gone. My car was found abandoned on the side of the road the next day. I never drove it again. Couldn't stand to be in it after what happened. It's been 2 years, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've gone to therapy, moved to a new town, but I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Trust your instincts and never ever put yourself in a vulnerable position with strangers, no matter how harmless they might seem. I was lucky to escape. Others might not be. That night started like any other. I arrived around 10 p.m., relieving the day shift. Josh was already there, restocking shelves and getting things set up for the long night ahead. We made small talk as I settled in behind the register. It was a slow night, just the occasional trucker stopping for coffee or locals grabbing snacks. Around midnight, our other co-worker Nick showed up. He wasn't scheduled to work, and I could immediately tell something was off. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. Josh tensed up as soon as Nick stumbled through the door. There had been some issues with Nick lately. He'd been reprimanded for making inappropriate comments and advances towards me. I tried to avoid being alone with him whenever possible. Nick slurred something about wanting to talk to Josh. I offered to take over at the register so they could step outside. Part of me hoped Josh could calm Nick down and send him home to sleep it off. I busied myself with straightening items on the counter, trying not to eavesdrop but unable to fully tune out their raised voices. Suddenly, I heard a scuffle and looked up to see Josh stumbling backwards through the door, his hands raised. Nick followed, brandishing a large hunting knife. My blood ran cold as I took in the crazed look in his eyes. This wasn't just drunk Nick being an ass. Something had snapped. "You think you can just fire me and ruin my life?" Nick was shouting, gesturing wildly with the knife. "I've got nothing left thanks to you." Josh was trying to reason with him, hands still up in a placating gesture. "Come on, man, put the knife down. You're drunk. You don't want to do this. Just go home and sleep it off." But Nick wasn't listening. His eyes darted around wildly before landing on me. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, if it isn't little Emma, Josh's favorite. This is perfect." He lunged towards me and I stumbled back, knocking over a display of chips. Josh tried to grab Nick, but he swung the knife, catching Josh's arm. I saw blood and heard Josh cry out in pain. Everything after that was a blur of terror and adrenaline. Nick vaulted over the counter, knife raised. I scrambled backwards, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. My fingers closed around a heavy flashlight we kept under the counter for emergencies. Nick's free hand grabbed my shirt, yanking me towards him. I swung the flashlight with all my strength, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered, but didn't go down. I could see the rage in his eyes as he raised the knife again. Suddenly there was a loud bang and Nick crumpled to the floor. I looked up to see a man in a paramedic uniform standing in the doorway, gun raised. He must have stopped for coffee and witnessed the attack. The next few hours were a whirlwind of police statements and paramedics treating Josh's arm. I was in shock, trembling uncontrollably as I tried to recount what happened. Nick had been shot in the shoulder, not life-threatening, but enough to take him down. He was arrested and taken to the hospital under police guard. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to process what had happened. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every little sound. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, reliving those terrifying moments when I thought I was going to die. Josh and I both quit our jobs at the gas station. I couldn't bear the thought of working nights anymore, let alone in that place where it all happened. We kept in touch, bonded by our shared trauma. Nick was convicted and sent to prison. I thought that would be the end of it, that I could finally start to move on and heal. But last week, I got a call that shook me to my core. Nick is up for parole. There's a chance he could be released. All those feelings of fear and helplessness came rushing back. I'm terrified of running into him, of him seeking revenge. I jump every time my phone rings or there's a knock at the door. I don't know how to move forward from this. The idea that he could be out there, free to potentially hurt me or others, is paralyzing. I feel like I'm right back in that gas station, cornered and afraid for my life. Will I ever feel safe again? How do I overcome this constant state of fear and hypervigilance? I'm trying to take it one day at a time, but some days it feels impossible. I just want to feel normal again, to not be haunted by the memory of that night and the threat of what could still happen. I'm sorry for dumping all of this out there. I guess I just needed to get it off my chest, to feel like someone else understands. If anyone has been through something similar or has advice on dealing with this kind of trauma and fear, I'd be grateful to hear it. I'm tired of feeling like a victim, of letting that one horrible night define my life. But I don't know how to move past it when the threat feels so real and immediate again. For now, I'm just trying to breathe, to remind myself that I survived once and I can do it again. But it's hard. So hard. I never imagined my life would be shaped by something like this. I keep wondering what I could have done differently if there were warning signs I missed. I've considered moving, changing my name, trying to disappear so he can never find me. But then I think, why should I have to uproot my entire life? Why am I the one still paying the price for his actions? I'm angry. I'm scared. I'm exhausted. Some days I can barely function, paralyzed by the fear of what might happen. Other days I try to convince myself I'm overreacting, that he probably won't even remember me. But then I recall the look in his eyes that night, the cruel smile when he realized he could use me to hurt Josh, and I know that's just wishful thinking. I'm seeing a therapist, trying to work through the PTSD and anxiety, but it feels like I've taken 10 steps backward. All the progress I'd made over the years feels erased by this new threat. I find myself researching self-defense classes, home security systems, anything that might help me feel safer. But will anything ever really be enough? How do I learn to trust the world again when it feels like danger could be lurking around any corner? I'm sorry for rambling. I don't even know if I'm making sense anymore. I just needed to get this out, to feel less alone in my fear and uncertainty. If anyone has any words of encouragement or advice, I'd be so grateful. I'm trying to stay strong, but some days it feels impossible. I just want to feel safe again. At first, I didn't think much of it. Late-night orders weren't super common, but they happened often enough. But as I looked at the details, something felt off. The delivery address was for a spot deep in the local nature preserve, miles from any houses or buildings. Who the hell orders pizza to the middle of the woods at 2 a.m. on a weeknight? I showed it to my manager, thinking it had to be a mistake. He just shrugged and said if they paid, we deliver. I tried calling the number on the order to confirm, but it went straight to voicemail. Against my better judgment, I decided to just go ahead with the delivery. I figured maybe it was for some park rangers working late or something. As I drove out there, an uneasy feeling started creeping over me. The roads got narrower and darker as I left town, with thick forest pressing in on both sides. My headlights seemed to barely penetrate the pitch blackness ahead. I kept expecting to see some lights or a cabin or something, but there was nothing but trees. When I finally reached the GPS coordinates from the order, I found myself on a narrow dirt road deep in the woods. There were no buildings in sight, just an old rusty gate blocking the road ahead. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, peering into the darkness. Part of me wanted to just turn around and leave, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd come all this way, might as well finish the job. I got out of the car, pizza bag in hand, and called out, "Hello, pizza delivery." My voice sounded small and swallowed up by the vastness of the dark forest. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard a twig snap somewhere in the trees to my left. "Over here," a man's voice called out. It sounded off somehow, flat and emotionless. I turned towards it, straining to see anything in the gloom. Where exactly?" I replied, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "I can't really see you." "Just come a little closer," the voice said, "by the big oak tree." I took a few hesitant steps forward, pizza bag clutched to my chest like a shield. As my eyes adjusted, I could just barely make out a human silhouette standing perfectly still among the trees about 20 feet away. Something about the way they were standing, so unnaturally motionless, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "That'll be $24.50, I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Do you, want me to bring it over to you?" The figure didn't respond for a long moment. Then, in that same emotionless tone, "Yes, come here." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to take a few more steps forward. I just wanted to hand over this damn pizza and get the hell out of there. As I got closer, I started to make out more details of the man. He was tall and lanky, wearing dark clothes that seemed to blend into the shadows. But his face, I couldn't see his face at all. It was like a blank void where features should be. I was about 10 feet away when he suddenly lunged at me with shocking speed. His arms shot out, unnaturally long, reaching for me with grasping fingers. I yelled and stumbled backwards, dropping the pizza bag. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of his face, pale, gaunt, with huge black eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth stretched into a horrific grin. I turned and ran, heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I heard the man, the thing, let out an inhuman shriek that chilled me to my core. As I sprinted back towards my car, I became aware of movement in the woods on either side of me. More dark figures emerging from the trees, racing to cut me off. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. Just as I got the engine started, something slammed into the driver's side door with enough force to rock the whole vehicle. I looked over and found myself staring into those huge, soulless black eyes, just inches away through the window. That terrible mouth opened impossibly wide and let out another piercing shriek. I stomped on the gas and the tires squealed as I peeled out of there. In my rearview mirror, I could see multiple dark shapes chasing after me, moving with terrifying speed. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I went straight to the police station and reported everything. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They called the number from the order, but it was disconnected. The name on it was probably fake, too. In the days that followed, I scoured local news and police reports, convinced I'd see something about other attacks or disappearances in that area. But there was nothing. It was like it never happened. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress and late nights had caused me to hallucinate. But then I remember those eyes, that inhuman shriek, and I know it was real. I quit my delivery job the next day. I don't go out to the woods anymore, especially not at night. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can hear that awful shriek in the distance. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten just a little closer, if I hadn't managed to get away. What were those things? What did they want with me? I don't have any answers. All I know is that something evil is out there in those woods. And if you ever get a late-night delivery order to a strange, isolated location, just don't go. It's not worth the risk. Trust me on that. It was early October, and my sister had just left for a week-long trip to Florida. I was excited to have the house to myself for a change, planning movie nights and inviting friends over. Little did I know that my peaceful week alone would turn into a nightmare. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard a knock at the front door. It was already dark outside, which made me a bit uneasy. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I cautiously approached the door and peeked through the peephole. There stood a man, probably in his early 40s, with a scruffy beard and wearing a worn-out jacket. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, Looking nervous, I called out, asking who it was, but he just mumbled something I couldn't understand. My heart started racing. I told him I wasn't interested in whatever he was selling, and he needed to leave. After a moment, he turned and walked away. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was probably just a door-to-door salesman or someone lost. But something about his demeanor felt off. The next day, I was working from home when I heard another knock around lunchtime. My stomach dropped when I looked through the peephole and saw the same man. This time, he was more insistent, knocking repeatedly and calling out, "Please, I need help." I was scared but also angry. Why was he back? I shouted through the door that I would call the police if he didn't leave immediately. He hesitated for a moment, then walked away quickly. I watched through the window as he got into an old blue sedan parked down the street and drove off. At this point, I was seriously freaked out. I called my sister, but she didn't answer. I left her a voicemail explaining what had happened and asked her to call me back as soon as possible. I also texted a few friends, letting them know what was going on. One of them offered to come stay with me, but I stubbornly refused, not wanting to admit how scared I really was. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining the man outside, watching the house. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a persistent salesman or someone genuinely in need of help. But my gut told me something wasn't right. The third day is when things went from unsettling to terrifying. I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard a strange scratching sound coming from the side of the house. At first, I thought it might be a branch scraping against the siding, but then I realized there weren't any trees close enough to the house for that. My heart pounding, I crept to the window and peeked out. What I saw made my blood run cold. The man was there, crouched by the side of the house, running his fingers along the siding as if looking for a way in. When he saw me, his eyes locked with mine, and a desperate look came over his face. He started banging on the window, yelling, "Please, I'm hurt, I need help." But I could see no signs of injury. His eyes were wild, almost manic. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my phone. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. As I was talking to the dispatcher, I heard a loud thud from the back of the house. Oh God, was he trying to break in through the back door? I ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I could hear him moving around outside, his footsteps circling the house. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. The man kept calling out, his voice becoming more frantic and angry. "Let me in! Why won't you help me?" he screamed. I was terrified he would break a window or somehow get inside before help arrived. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The man must have heard them too, because suddenly everything went quiet. When the police arrived, they found no sign of him. The old blue sedan was gone from down the street. The officers searched the area and took my statement. They found scratch marks on the siding and footprints in the flower beds, confirming that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. They promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood and gave me some advice on improving home security. But even with their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of violation and fear. Why had this man targeted my house? How long had he been watching me? What would have happened if he had managed to get inside? The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. My sister cut her trip short and came home early. We installed new locks and a security system, but I still didn't feel safe. Every car that drove by, every unexpected noise made me jump. It's been a few weeks now, and there's been no sign of the man. The police haven't been able to identify him or find any leads. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted, if there was some innocent explanation for his behavior. But then I remember the desperate look in his eyes. the sound of his hands scratching at the walls of my home, and I know that whatever his intentions were, they weren't good. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others, especially those who live alone. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to ask for help or call the authorities. I shudder to think what might have happened if I hadn't. I still have nightmares about that man. In my dreams, I see his face pressed against the window, his fingers clawing at the glass. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he's in the house. It's going to take a long time before I feel truly safe again. The hardest part is not knowing who he was, what he wanted, or if he'll ever come back. Every time I see a blue sedan on the street, my heart races. Every unexpected knock at the door makes me freeze in terror. I've considered moving, but part of me feels like that would be letting him win. This is my home, and I don't want to be driven out by fear. But at the same time, I don't know if I'll ever be able to feel completely at ease here again. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window, scanning the street for any sign of him. Is he still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity? The uncertainty is almost worse than the actual encounters. I've started seeing a therapist to help deal with the anxiety and fear. She's helping me process the experience and develop coping strategies. But it's a slow process. Every unexpected sound still makes me jump, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder when I'm out in public. I know that statistically, the chances of something like this happening again are slim. But statistics don't mean much when you've lived through something like this. The feeling of vulnerability, of knowing that someone out there had singled you out for whatever twisted reason, it changes you. I'm trying to take back control of my life, to not let this experience define me. But it's hard. The world feels different now, less safe. I find myself studying the faces of strangers, wondering if they have hidden motives or dark secrets. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's the importance of community. The support of my friends and family has been crucial in helping me get through this. If you're going through something similar, don't try to handle it alone. Reach out, seek help, and remember that it's okay to be scared. I don't know if I'll ever get answers about what really happened those 3 days in October, but I do know that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I survived, I'm healing, and I'm determined not to let fear control my life. If you're reading this and have gone through something similar, know that you're not alone. We may be strangers, but we're connected by our shared experiences and our resilience in the face of the unknown. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, always trust your instincts. I vaguely remember stumbling into my house and collapsing on the living room sofa, still in my party clothes. I passed out almost immediately. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of my front door creaking open. At first, in my groggy state, I thought maybe I had forgotten to lock it properly. But then I heard hushed male voices and footsteps. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Someone was breaking in. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The living room was dark, and I was laying on the sofa with my back to the door. I don't think they saw me at first. "Coast is clear," one of them whispered. "Told you the place would be empty. Saw the guy leave earlier without his car." My stomach dropped. They had been watching my house, waiting for me to leave. If only I'd driven myself home instead of Ubering, they might have assumed I was still there. I heard them moving around the entryway, opening drawers and rustling through things. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I try to make a run for it, confront them, call the police, but my phone was in my jacket pocket, which I'd tossed on a chair across the room. I decided the safest thing was to stay absolutely still and hope they didn't notice me in the darkness. Slowly, carefully, I eased myself off the sofa and onto the floor behind it. I curled up as small as I could, barely breathing. The footsteps came closer as they entered the living room. I could see flashlight beams sweeping across the walls and ceiling. "Check out this TV," one of them said. "We can definitely sell that." "Grab those laptops on the desk too," the other replied. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing them not to look behind the sofa. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they must be able to hear it. I've never felt fear like that before. The utter helplessness of being invaded in my own home, not knowing if they were armed or what they might do if they found me. They moved on to the kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers. I heard the clink of bottles as they went through my liquor collection. Then footsteps on the stairs as they headed up to the bedrooms. I stayed frozen in place, afraid to move a muscle. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I had no idea how long they were upstairs, but it felt like hours. Eventually I heard them coming back down, their arms apparently full of my belongings. "This should be enough," one said. "Let's get out of here before anyone notices." "Hold up, I want to check the basement real quick. Rich folks always keep good stuff down there." I held my breath as one set of footsteps headed towards the basement door. "Please don't come back in here," I silently begged. After a minute, he returned. "Nothing worth taking. Come on, let's go." I heard the front door open and close. Then silence. I stayed absolutely still, straining my ears for any sign they might still be there. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to peer over the edge of the sofa. The house was dark and quiet. On shaky legs, I stumbled to the front window and peeked out through the curtains. I saw the taillights of a car turning the corner at the end of my street. Only then did I break down, my whole body trembling as the adrenaline wore off. I sank to the floor and sobbed, overcome with relief and lingering terror. When I finally pulled myself together, I turned on all the lights and grabbed my phone to call the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I walked through the house assessing the damage. They'd taken my TV, laptops, tablets, some jewelry, and various other electronics and valuables. My bedroom was a disaster, drawers dumped out, closet ransacked. But honestly, I didn't care about any of that. I was just grateful to be alive and unharmed. The police came and took my statement, dusted for fingerprints, the whole CSI routine. But I knew the chances of catching the guys were slim. They clearly knew what they were doing. It's been a few months now, and I've beefed up my home security big time. New locks, alarm system, the works. But I still have trouble sleeping at night. Every little noise makes me jump. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering what might have happened if they'd found me. The crazy thing is, if I hadn't been so drunk and passed out on the sofa instead of going to bed, I probably would have heard them breaking in and been able to call the police right away. It's like the universe aligned in this weird way where I was home, but they thought I wasn't. And I was awake enough to know what was happening, but too terrified to do anything. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe in my home again. The idea that someone could violate my space like that, touch all my things, is just so unsettling. I'm thinking of moving, honestly. Starting fresh somewhere new where I don't have all these bad memories and associations. I guess the lesson here is to always be aware of your surroundings and take home security seriously. You never think something like this will happen to you until it does. I'm just thankful it wasn't worse. Those guys could have been violent, or I could have panicked and confronted them. Who knows how that might have ended? So yeah, that's my story. Sorry for the long post, but I needed to get it out. Be safe out there, everyone, and maybe think twice about how much you drink on New Year's Eve. It was a typical Tuesday evening. I had just finished dinner and was settling in for a quiet night at home with my dog, Hazel. She's a sweet golden retriever, about 5 years old, and usually pretty calm. We were cuddled up on the couch watching TV when Hazel suddenly perked up her ears and started growling softly. At first, I didn't think much of it. She sometimes gets excited by squirrels or other animals in the backyard. But then she jumped off the couch and ran to the back door, barking furiously. This was unusual for her. Hazel rarely barks unless something's really wrong. I got up to check what was bothering her, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary through the glass door. The backyard looked normal in the dim porch light, but Hazel wouldn't stop barking and scratching at the door. "What is it, girl?" I asked, peering out into the darkness. Still nothing. I opened the door a crack, thinking maybe she needed to go out. But instead of running outside like she usually would, Hazel cowered back, whining. Her tail was tucked between her legs. Something had her seriously spooked. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I quickly shut and locked the door, double-checking that it was secure. "It's okay, Hazel," I said, trying to soothe her. But she kept pacing anxiously, looking back at the door and whimpering. I tried to shake off my growing sense of dread. "You're being silly," I told myself. "There's nothing out there." But I couldn't quite convince myself. Hazel's behavior was just too out of character. To ease my nerves, I did a walkthrough of the house, checking that all the doors and windows were locked. Everything seemed fine, but I still felt on edge. I left a few extra lights on and tried to go about my evening routine. Hazel wouldn't settle down, though. She kept circling the living room, ears pricked, occasionally letting out a low growl. I found myself jumping at every little noise, the hum of the refrigerator, a car passing on the street outside. Around 11 p.m., I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping things would feel less creepy in the morning. I made sure Hazel was in my bedroom with me, the door firmly closed. She curled up on her dog bed, still alert, but quieter now. I tossed and turned for a while, before finally drifting off into an uneasy sleep. I'm not sure how long I was out when something woke me with a start. For a moment, I lay completely still, heart pounding, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. Then I realized the bedroom door was open. I was positive I'd closed it when we came to bed. A chill ran through me as I sat up, squinting into the darkness. "Hazel," I whispered. No response. She wasn't on her bed anymore. Panic rising in my chest, I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, using the screen light to illuminate the room. Empty. Where was Hazel? I got out of bed on shaky legs, straining my ears for any sound. The house was eerily silent. I crept to the doorway, heart racing. "Hazel," I called again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Fighting back tears of fear, I made my way down the hallway, checking rooms as I went. Living room, empty. Bathroom, empty. I was about to check the kitchen when I heard a small whimper. "Hazel!" I rushed towards the sound. There, in the dim light filtering through the kitchen window, I saw her. She was huddled under the table, shaking violently. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, dropping to my knees beside her. "What happened? What's wrong?" That's when I noticed the back door. It was wide open, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Ice flooded my veins. Someone had been in the house, maybe still was. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I scooped up Hazel, who was still trembling uncontrollably, and ran for the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. Finally, I got it open and sprinted across the lawn to my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, screaming for help. Lights flicked on, and Tom, my elderly neighbor, opened the door in his bathrobe, looking bewildered. "Someone's in my house," I gasped out between sobs. "Please call the police." The next hour or so passed in a blur. Police arrived, lights flashing. They searched my house thoroughly while I sat in Tom's living room, clutching Hazel and trying to stop shaking long enough to answer their questions. Eventually, an officer came to speak with me. They hadn't found anyone inside, he said, but there were signs of intrusion, muddy footprints in the kitchen and living room that weren't mine. And disturbingly, they found more prints upstairs. Someone had been in my bedroom while I was sleeping. The officer asked if anything was missing, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside to check. They took photos and samples of the footprints for evidence. Apparently they were unusual, not a typical shoe print, but they couldn't tell me more than that. I ended up staying with my parents for a week after that. I just couldn't face going back to the house alone. When I finally did return, I had new security cameras installed and got better locks for all the doors and windows. But even now, months later, I don't feel safe there. I jump at every noise. I triple-check the locks before bed. Hazel still seems on edge too, especially at night. Sometimes she'll suddenly start growling at nothing, and my heart stops, wondering if the intruder has returned. The police never found any suspects. They said there had been no similar break-ins reported in the area. It's like this person appeared out of nowhere, invaded my home, and then vanished without a trace. I'm left with so many unanswered questions. Who was in my house that night? What did they want? Why didn't they take anything? And those strange footprints, what kind of person leaves marks like that? I don't know if I'll ever get answers. Part of me doesn't want to know. I just want to feel safe in my own home again. But I'm not sure that will ever happen. The memory of that night, the open doors, Hazel shaking under the table, the knowledge that someone had been in my bedroom while I slept, it haunts me. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're watching me, waiting to come back. And the worst part is not knowing why. Was it random, or was I specifically targeted? Will they return? Sometimes I think about moving, starting fresh somewhere new. But then I wonder, would it even make a difference? Would I ever really feel safe again, knowing what happened? I'm sharing this as a warning, I guess, to remind everyone to be vigilant, to take home security seriously. You never think something like this will happen to you until it does. And once it does, it changes everything. I'm grateful that Hazel and I weren't hurt, but the sense of violation, the fear, that's a wound that's taking a long time to heal. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe it will help someone else stay safe. And selfishly, maybe getting it off my chest will help me start to move past it. But I know one thing for certain, I'll never forget that night, or shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was in my house might someday come back, and next time we might not be so lucky.